Have you ever noticed how the quietest moments in a relationship can be the loudest ones? Have you ever found something small, something ordinary, something that wasn't meant for you, and suddenly, everything you thought was steady begins to feel slightly uncertain? Not because of what you saw, but because of what was never said. And have you ever loved someone so deeply that instead of asking the difficult question, you chose silence, hoping peace would protect the love you built? Tonight's story is not about betrayal. It is not about shouting, drama, or broken promises. It is about something far more subtle, far more realistic, and far more common than most people are willing to admit. It is about how silence, when left unspoken for too long, can quietly create distance between two people who truly love each other. Welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where every story is not just meant to entertain you, but to gently teach us something about love, life, and emotional growth. If you believe that real love is not perfect but intentional, take a moment to like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this may feel quiet on the surface, but their lessons can change how we see relationships forever. Now, let me ask you one more question before we begin. What would you do if on Valentine's night, you found a receipt that wasn't meant for you? The receipt lay between them on the kitchen counter, thin and quiet, as if it already understood it had arrived in the wrong hands. Emma did not pick it up again. Daniel did not move it away. And in that silence, long enough for the refrigerator hum to become louder than usual, long enough for the soft February air slipping through the slightly open window to feel colder than it should have, the atmosphere inside their apartment shifted in a way neither of them could explain. Outside, life continued as if nothing had changed. A distant laugh echoed from the street below. A car door slammed. Footsteps passed. Ordinary sounds. Inside, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Emma leaned lightly against the counter, her arms loosely crossed, not defensive, not relaxed, just still. Her eyes did not rest on Daniel. They rested on the receipt, folded once, then twice, then placed back exactly where she had found it. Carefully, almost gently, as if the paper itself could be hurt by rough handling. Daniel stood near the sink, his hand resting on the edge of the counter. He wasn't looking at the receipt. He was looking at her hands. He had always watched her hands, even from the beginning. They told him things her words never did. And tonight, her hands were steady. Too steady. That frightened him more than anger ever could have. "Do you want dinner?" Emma asked quietly. Her voice was calm, ordinary, almost soft enough to blend into the hum of the refrigerator. The question felt painfully normal. Daniel blinked once, as if returning from somewhere far away. "I already made pasta," he replied. "It's in the fridge." She nodded. Okay, that was all. No accusation, no tension in her tone, no questions, just acceptance. And sometimes, silence can be more unsettling than confrontation. They moved around the kitchen the way they always did, familiar, coordinated, careful not to bump into each other, like two people who had lived inside the same rhythm for years. Plates were taken out, water glasses filled, chairs pulled back softly, their knees brushed once under the table. Neither of them acknowledged it, neither of them pulled away, but neither of them lingered either. He waited for her to ask. She waited for him to explain, and neither of them spoke. This was not avoidance in the obvious sense. It was something quieter, something learned, something practiced over years of believing that peace was more valuable than discomfort. Emma had not always been this composed. As a child, she lived in a house where raised voices were treated like emergencies. Her mother believed arguments were signs of failure. Her father believed endurance was a form of love. So disagreements were handled gently, quietly, and often incompletely. They never shouted. They never slammed doors. They simply stopped talking about difficult things until the tension dissolved on its own, or buried itself deep enough to be forgotten. When Emma cried as a little girl, her mother would sit beside her, stroke her hair, and say nothing. Not because she didn't care, but because she believed feelings were storms that passed on their own if left undisturbed. And Emma learned. She learned that asking too many questions created tension. She learned that silence preserved peace. She learned that composure was safer than confrontation. By the time she became an adult, she had mastered the art of swallowing curiosity before it reached her lips. Not suppression. Survival. Dressed as emotional maturity. Daniel, on the other hand, grew up in the opposite kind of home. Loud. Unpredictable, sharp with words that were spoken too quickly and regretted too late. His father believed in saying things as they are, but honesty in that house often arrived without gentleness. Arguments escalated fast, apologies came slower, and silence, in the aftermath, always felt safer than risking another explosion. One night, when he was 12, a careless sentence spoken in anger shattered the fragile peace in their living room. No one meant the words the way they sounded, but once spoken, they could not be taken back. He never forgot that. From that day forward, Daniel learned a different lesson from Emma. Not that silence prevents conflict, but that speaking too soon can cause irreversible damage. So he grew into a man who paused before responding, who measured his words, who believed that if something truly mattered, it would eventually surface on its own, or dissolve. It was why, 3 years ago, when he met Emma in a quiet bookstore on a rainy afternoon, their first interaction felt strangely natural. They had reached for the same book of poetry at the same time. Their fingers brushed briefly. They both smiled. Neither of them spoke immediately. And somehow, that silence felt comfortable, safe. Their relationship did not begin with long conversations or dramatic confessions. It began with proximity, with routine, with presence. Emma started sitting at the same corner table in the cafe where Daniel graded papers every Thursday evening. At first, they exchanged polite nods, then small smiles, then occasional comments about the weather, books, or the music playing softly in the background. Weeks passed before their conversations grew longer. Months passed before he held her hand. And when they finally said, "I love you," the words came out softly, almost shyly, like they were borrowing a language neither of them had fully practiced. What they built together was not loud passion. It was steady warmth, shared grocery lists, quiet dinners, evenings on the couch reading separate books with their legs touching, morning coffee placed beside each other without needing to ask. And in that quiet, they felt understood. But here is the truth most people don't talk about. Silence, when healthy, feels like peace. But silence, when overused, can slowly become distance. Back in the kitchen, Emma twirled her fork gently through the pasta on her plate. She ate slowly, calmly, normally, too normally. Daniel noticed every detail. She didn't reach for his hand across the table like she sometimes did. She didn't ask about his day midway through dinner. She didn't glance at him as often. Instead, she focused on small, controlled movements. The receipt remained on the counter behind them, unmoved, unmentioned, unexplained, and yet emotionally present in every second of that evening. From an educational perspective, this moment reveals something deeply important about human behavior in relationships. When people feel emotionally uncertain, they rarely react with immediate confrontation, especially if they were raised in environments where conflict was discouraged or feared. Instead, they observe. They withdraw slightly. They analyze silently. Emma was not assuming the worst. She was processing. And processing, for her, had always looked like quiet composure. Daniel finished his meal but barely tasted it. The normalcy of the evening pressed against his chest like invisible weight. He cleared his throat slightly, then stopped, because speaking now, after so much silence, suddenly felt heavier than it should have. He glanced toward the counter. The receipt was still there, waiting, not accusing, just existing. And sometimes, the smallest unanswered detail can create the loudest internal questions. Emma stood, gathered the plates, and walked to the sink with the same gentle movements she always had. Routine, graceful, controlled. Daniel watched her for a long moment before finally looking away. He told himself the same thing he had told himself for years. If it matters, she will ask. If it doesn't, silence will keep the peace. But what he did not realize was this. She was telling herself something too. If it matters, he will explain. If he doesn't, then maybe he believes it doesn't matter. And between those two quiet beliefs, a misunderstanding had already begun to grow. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way distance often does in relationships that look peaceful on the outside. And the receipt remained on the counter, small, ordinary and silent, yet powerful enough to reveal a lesson many couples learn too late. Unspoken things do not disappear. They settle, they linger, and if left too long, they begin to reshape how love feels. The receipt stayed exactly where it was the next morning. Not because Emma forgot about it, and not because Daniel didn't notice it. It remained there because neither of them moved things that carried emotional weight, unless absolutely necessary. The sunlight crept slowly across the kitchen counter, touching the edge of the folded paper first, before stretching toward the coffee maker. It was an ordinary morning in every visible way. The kettle whistled softly. The toast popped. The faint scent of coffee filled the apartment. Routine continued. And yet, something inside that routine had shifted. Emma stood near the window, stirring her tea with slow, deliberate motions. The spoon tapped lightly against the cup in a soft, rhythmic sound. She did not look at the counter, but she knew the receipt was still there. Awareness does not always require eye contact. Daniel walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, his footsteps quiet, measured. He paused briefly when he saw the paper still resting in the same place. A small object, a large presence. He considered picking it up, explaining, clarifying. But then another thought followed immediately, one he'd relied on his entire adult life. Don't create tension where there is none. From a psychological perspective, this is a common emotional pattern. People who grew up in loud or unstable environments often avoid initiating difficult conversations, not because they are hiding something, but because they associate confrontation with escalation. To them, silence feels like prevention. But prevention and avoidance are not the same thing. Did you sleep well? Emma asked softly, still facing the window. Daniel blinked, slightly surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Yes, he replied. You? She nodded. I did. Another pause. Calm, gentle, familiar, and yet, not entirely the same. Emma took a sip of her tea before finally walking toward the counter. For a brief second, her fingers hovered near the receipt. She did not touch it. Instead, she picked up her mug and moved past it, as if it were just another piece of paper. That choice was not accidental. It was restraint. There is an educational truth hidden in moments like this. When individuals value emotional peace over immediate clarity, they often delay addressing uncertainty, not out of weakness, but out of emotional conditioning. Emma was not afraid of the truth. She was afraid of unnecessary conflict. And in her experience, questions sometimes created storms that could have been avoided. Daniel watched her quietly as he poured his coffee. He noticed something subtle, something most people would have missed. She didn't hum that morning. Emma always hummed in the mornings, soft, absent-minded melodies while preparing tea or organizing small things around the kitchen. It was one of those quiet habits that made their home feel warm. Today, there was no humming, just silence, not cold, not distant, just quieter than usual. They sat across from each other at the small dining table. The chairs made faint sounds as they settled into them. Outside, the world moved as it always did, cars passing, footsteps on the sidewalk, distant city life unfolding without pause. Inside, time felt slower. Emma spread a thin layer of butter across her toast, carefully, evenly, as if precision could anchor her thoughts. Daniel glanced at her once. Then again, he opened his mouth slightly, closed it, took a sip of coffee instead. Because in his mind, timing mattered. And the timing never felt right once silence had already settled in. Another important life lesson exists here. The longer a difficult conversation is postponed, the heavier it becomes emotionally. Not because the issue grows larger, but because the silence surrounding it grows thicker. Emma finished her breakfast and stood up to rinse her plate. "Are you heading to work early today?" she asked, her tone steady. "Probably," Daniel replied. "I have a meeting at 10. She nodded. "That makes sense." Again, normal words, normal tone. But emotional perception is rarely based only on words. It is shaped by patterns, and Daniel knew her patterns. She usually asked a follow-up question, usually smiled a little more, usually lingered just a second longer before walking away. Today, she didn't. She rinsed the plate, dried her hands, and walked toward the living room with calm composure. Not avoidance, not anger, just quiet processing. As the front door closed behind him later that morning, Daniel paused in the hallway outside their apartment for longer than necessary. He rested his hand briefly on the doorknob, his thoughts heavier than he expected. He wasn't guilty. He knew that. But emotional tension does not require guilt to exist. Sometimes, it only requires uncertainty. At work, he found it unusually difficult to concentrate. Papers remained half-graded, emails were opened and reread without response. His mind returned repeatedly to the same image, the receipt on the counter, untouched. He replayed the previous night in his head, her steady hands, her calm voice, her lack of questions, and slowly, a realization began to form. She wasn't ignoring it. She was waiting. That thought unsettled him more than confrontation would have, because waiting, in emotionally mature relationships, often signals something deeper than anger. It signals observation. Back at the apartment, Emma folded laundry in the quiet living room. The television played softly in the background, though she wasn't truly watching it. Her movements were precise, almost meditative. Shirt, fold, stack, towel, fold, stack. Routine can be a powerful emotional regulation tool. When the mind feels uncertain, the body often seeks structure. She paused for a moment when she heard the faint crinkle of paper in her memory, the sound the receipt made when it slipped from Daniel's coat pocket the night before. She had not been searching for anything suspicious. She had only been hanging his coat. The paper had fallen on its own, like an uninvited truth. Educationally, this moment reflects a critical relational concept. Discoveries that happen accidentally often create more internal conflict than those found intentionally. Because the mind struggles between curiosity and fairness. Emma did not want to assume. She did not want to accuse. She did not want to disrupt the emotional peace they had built over 3 years. And yet, she also understood something important about herself. Silence protected her childhood home. But adulthood required clarity. Still, old habits are not easily replaced. That afternoon, she passed by the kitchen several times. Each time, her eyes briefly acknowledged the receipt's presence, without fully engaging with it. It remained folded, still, patient, like a quiet question waiting for the right moment to be asked. When Daniel returned home in the evening, the first thing he noticed was the soft lamplight in the living room and the faint smell of freshly cooked food. Everything looked warm, familiar, peaceful. Emma sat on the couch, reading, exactly as she often did. He removed his shoes quietly and walked into the kitchen. The receipt was still there. He exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in understanding. This silence was no longer accidental. It was mutual. And mutual silence, while calm on the surface, can sometimes create emotional distance if left unresolved. "Dinner smells good," he said gently. Emma looked up and gave a small smile. "I made something simple." He nodded. "Thank you." They moved through the evening with the same careful normalcy as the night before. Plates were served, water poured, chairs adjusted softly, their knees brushed again under the table. This time, Emma noticed it longer than usual, but she still did not move away. Because despite the quiet tension, affection had not disappeared. And that is another important educational truth about healthy relationships. Emotional uncertainty does not automatically erase love. It simply tests the strength of communication within that love. After dinner, Emma stood near the counter once more. Her eyes rested on the receipt for a full 3 seconds this time, longer than before. Then she picked it up, folded, unfolded, read the printed lines briefly. Restaurant name, 2 entrees, 2 desserts, date, 2 nights ago, Valentine's week. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something inside her shifted, not toward suspicion, but toward reflection. She placed the receipt back down carefully and turned toward Daniel, who was watching her now without pretending otherwise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. And somewhere between emotional restraint and growing awareness, a quiet realization formed in both of them at the same time. The issue was no longer the receipt itself. It was the silence surrounding it. And silence, when stretched across multiple days, begins to ask its own questions, even when people do not. Emma walked past him slowly and sat beside him on the couch. Not too close, not too far, just beside him. Shared space, shared quiet, shared thoughts neither of them had voiced yet. And as the night settled around them once again, one subtle lesson became clearer than ever. In relationships built on peace, the greatest challenges rarely arrive with loud conflict. They arrive quietly, in the form of small, unanswered moments that slowly reshape emotional perception. The receipt remained on the counter, still small, still ordinary, still silent, but now it was no longer just a piece of paper. It had become a mirror, reflecting not betrayal, not dishonesty, but something far more human. Two people who loved each other deeply, yet had both been taught that silence was safer than speaking too soon. If you've ever experienced a moment in love where silence said more than words, take a second to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories should not only entertain but also teach real life lessons about love and relationships, make sure you subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because the story you're about to hear might change how you see silence in love forever. Have you ever met someone who rarely argues, rarely raises their voice, rarely asks difficult questions, and you assume they are simply calm? But what if their silence was not natural peace, but something they learned long before they understood what love truly meant? Emma was not born quiet. She became quiet. And that distinction is important, because from an educational and psychological perspective, many adults do not choose their communication style consciously. They inherit it, slowly, subtly, from the emotional environment they grew up in. Emma's childhood home was never loud. That was the first thing anyone noticed when they visited. No shouting, no slammed doors, no heated arguments echoing through hallways. On the surface, it looked peaceful, almost ideal. Her mother spoke softly, even when upset. Her father rarely disagreed openly, and when he did, his voice remained controlled, measured, almost rehearsed. They believed, deeply and sincerely, that a good home was one where conflict was invisible. And for years, Emma believed that too. But silence in a household does not always mean harmony. Sometimes, it simply means emotions are being carefully hidden. When Emma was 7, she once asked her mother why her parents never argued like the family she saw on television. Her mother smiled gently and brushed a strand of hair behind Emma's ear. "Because we choose peace," she said. It sounded wise. It sounded mature. It sounded loving. And for a child, those words shaped everything. What Emma did not understand at that age was that her parents did disagree. They just did it quietly, indirectly, carefully. Conversations about serious matters happened behind closed doors, in hushed tones, or were postponed indefinitely until the tension faded into routine. There were long pauses at the dinner table some nights, not uncomfortable ones, just unfinished ones. From an educational standpoint, this kind of emotional environment teaches a child a powerful lesson. Peace is maintained not by resolving tension, but by minimizing its expression. Emma internalized that lesson deeply. One evening, when she was 10, she accidentally broke a glass cup while helping set the table. The sharp sound echoed briefly across the kitchen floor. She froze immediately. Her small hands trembled slightly as she looked at her parents, expecting disappointment, maybe even anger. But neither of them raised their voice. Her father simply walked over, knelt down, and began picking up the pieces carefully. Her mother placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder and said softly, "It's okay. Accidents happen." No lecture, no frustration, no emotional reaction. To an outsider, it would look like a perfect response. And in many ways, it was kind. But here is the deeper psychological layer. Emma never learned how to process mistakes through open emotional discussion. She learned to move past them quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention to the discomfort they caused. That moment stayed with her more than anyone realized. Because children do not only learn from what is said, they learn from what is not said. As Emma grew older, she became observant rather than expressive. She noticed small changes in tone, pauses in conversations, and subtle shifts in body language. Her emotional intelligence developed early, but it leaned heavily toward internal processing instead of external communication. At school, teachers often described her as well-behaved, composed, and mature for her age. She rarely complained, rarely argued, rarely demanded attention. But what they didn't see was how often she chose silence when something bothered her. Not because she lacked feelings, but because she had been conditioned to believe that expressing discomfort might disturb the emotional balance around her. By the time she reached her teenage years, this pattern became even more pronounced. There was a particular afternoon when she was 16 that quietly defined her emotional habits for years to come. She had studied for weeks for an important exam and expected a high score. When the results came back, she received a grade that was lower than she had hoped for. Not terrible, but disappointing. Her classmates reacted loudly to their results. Some celebrated, some complained, some argued with the teacher about grading errors. Emma said nothing. She folded her test paper neatly, placed it inside her notebook, and continued with the day as if nothing had happened. Later that evening, her mother noticed her unusual quietness. Is everything all right? Her mother asked gently. Emma hesitated for a second. She wanted to say, I'm disappointed. I feel like I could have done better. I'm upset. But instead, she smiled softly and said, Yes, everything is fine. And her mother, trusting her calm tone, accepted the answer. This is a crucial educational insight. When children repeatedly mask their emotions and are not encouraged to verbalize them, they slowly become adults who process feelings internally rather than externally. Emma was not suppressing emotions intentionally. She was managing them the only way she knew how, quietly. Her first experience with romantic feelings followed the same pattern. At 19, she developed a quiet affection for a classmate who often studied near her in the university library. They shared small conversations, exchanged polite smiles, and occasionally walked out of the building at the same time. She liked him, but she never said it. She never hinted. She never asked if he felt the same. Instead, she observed, waited, hoped that if it mattered, something would naturally unfold. Weeks passed. Then, months. One day, she saw him holding hands with someone else outside the campus cafe. Her heart tightened, not dramatically, not visibly, but deeply. Her friend later asked, Were you upset? Emma paused, then replied calmly, No, it wasn't anything serious. And that was the end of it. Or at least, the visible end. What she learned from that experience was not that love required courage. She learned that unspoken feelings simply fade if left alone long enough. Another quiet lesson added to her emotional blueprint. From a life education perspective, this is how emotional avoidance patterns are reinforced. Not through trauma alone, but through repeated small moments where silence feels safer than vulnerability. By the time Emma turned 25, she had become exceptionally composed. She handled stress with grace, responded to challenges with calm logic, and rarely allowed emotions to overflow into conversations. People admired that about her. They called her peaceful, emotionally strong, easy to be around, and in many ways she was. But there was a hidden cost to that composure. She struggled to ask difficult questions, not because she feared the answers, but because she feared disrupting emotional stability. So when she eventually met Daniel in that quiet bookstore on a rainy afternoon 3 years ago, something about him felt immediately familiar. He didn't speak excessively. He didn't dominate conversations. He didn't rush emotional moments. Their silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. And that comfort felt like compatibility. What Emma did not realize at the time was a subtle psychological truth. When two emotionally reserved people fall in love, their relationship often feels peaceful. But unresolved tensions may take longer to surface because both partners are skilled at emotional restraint. Back in the present, Emma stood in the living room holding a folded towel, her mind briefly drifting back to those early years. Not with regret, but with understanding. She glanced toward the kitchen, where the receipt still rested quietly on the counter. Her expression remained calm, her breathing steady. But internally, she was not ignoring the situation. She was processing it the same way she had processed nearly every emotional uncertainty in her life. Silently, carefully, thoughtfully. And here lies another important life lesson. Silence is not always indifference. Sometimes, it is reflection shaped by years of emotional conditioning. Emma did not assume betrayal. She did not imagine worst-case scenarios. She did not create dramatic conclusions. Instead, she observed Daniel's behavior. His pauses, his careful tone, his normal routines that felt slightly more deliberate than usual. She noticed everything, because quiet people often become highly perceptive observers. But perception without communication can slowly create emotional distance, especially in relationships built on mutual restraint. She placed the folded towel on the stack and sat down slowly on the couch, her gaze drifting once more toward the kitchen. The receipt remained small, ordinary, unthreatening, yet emotionally significant. Not because of what it proved, but because of what it represented, an unanswered moment. And Emma, shaped by a lifetime of quiet emotional habits, was doing exactly what she had always done in uncertain situations, waiting, not out of weakness, not out of fear, but out of a deeply learned belief that if something truly mattered, the truth would eventually surface on its own. There is a difference between being calm and learning to stay calm because expressing emotions once led to disappointment. Emma did not fully understand this difference until her early 20s. Up until then, her silence had always felt like strength, like maturity, like control. But life, in its quiet way, has a habit of testing the emotional habits we build in childhood. And for Emma, that test arrived not as a dramatic heartbreak, but as something much quieter, something almost invisible to everyone except her. It happened during her final year at university. By that time, she had already mastered routine as a form of emotional stability. Morning lectures, afternoon study sessions, evening walks back to her apartment. Her life moved in gentle patterns that rarely surprised her, and that predictability made her feel safe. That was also when she met Adrian. He was not loud, not overly charming, not the type of person who filled a room with energy, which perhaps was why she felt comfortable around him almost immediately. They often studied in the same section of the library, sitting at different tables at first, then gradually at the same one, without ever formally discussing the change. Their conversations began with small academic topics, assignments, deadlines, shared courses, but slowly extended into casual discussions about books, future plans, and daily routines. It was easy, natural, quiet, and for Emma, Quiet familiarity often translated into emotional trust. From an educational perspective, this is a common psychological pattern. Individuals who value emotional stability often form attachments through consistency rather than intense emotional expression. Adrian was consistent. He always arrived at the library around the same time, always greeted her with a soft smile, always asked if she had eaten lunch. Small gestures, subtle attention, nothing dramatic. And yet, over time, Emma found herself looking forward to those interactions more than she expected. She never labeled it as love. She never even labeled it as a crush. She simply allowed the feeling to exist, unspoken, undefined, and undisturbed. Because in her mind, naming emotions too quickly felt unnecessary. Weeks turned into months. They began walking out of the campus building together, after evening study sessions. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. And strangely, the silence never felt awkward. It felt shared. Comfortable silence can be deeply misleading in emotional development. It can create the illusion of mutual understanding even when important feelings remain unexpressed. One evening, as they walked past the campus cafe, Adrian casually mentioned that he enjoyed spending time with her. Emma smiled softly and nodded. "Me too," she replied. That was the closest either of them came to acknowledging anything deeper. And, in that moment, she believed that patience would naturally allow the relationship to grow. Because that was what she had always been taught, directly and indirectly. If something is genuine, it will unfold without force. However, life does not always reward emotional patience when communication is absent. One afternoon, Emma arrived at the library slightly later than usual. She spotted Adrian near the entrance, laughing gently with a girl she had never seen before. Their body language was relaxed, familiar. The girl held his arm lightly as they walked toward the cafe together. Emma paused for a brief second, not long enough to attract attention, not long enough to appear affected, just long enough for a quiet realization to settle inside her. She did not confront him. She did not ask questions. She did not assume anything immediately. Instead, she walked past them calmly, offered a polite smile, and continued toward her usual table. Her heart felt heavier, but her expression remained composed. Later that evening, Adrian approached her as usual, carrying his books. "Sorry I didn't sit with you earlier," he said casually. "I was catching up with someone." Emma nodded. "That's okay," and she meant it, at least partially. They studied together in silence for a while before he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, "She's my girlfriend. She transferred this semester." He said it gently, naturally, without hesitation, because in his mind, there had never been an emotional misunderstanding. In his mind, they were simply friends. Emma felt a quiet ache in her chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, just steady. But instead of expressing disappointment, instead of admitting that she had grown emotionally attached in silence, she responded with the same calm composure she had practiced her entire life. "That's nice," she said softly, and she even smiled. From a psychological and educational standpoint, this moment was pivotal. Emma was not rejected directly. She was not misled intentionally. She was not betrayed. She simply experienced the natural consequence of unexpressed feelings. And the lesson her mind absorbed was not, "I should communicate my emotions more clearly." Instead, the lesson became, unspoken feelings are safer because they cannot be rejected. That internal conclusion shaped her adult emotional behavior more than she realized. Over the following weeks, she maintained the same polite interactions with Adrian. She did not withdraw dramatically. She did not act distant. She simply adjusted her expectations quietly and continued her routine. Eventually, their conversations became less frequent, then occasional, then rare. And just like that, the emotional attachment faded, not loudly, not painfully, but gradually, almost invisibly. One night, her close friend noticed the subtle shift in her mood and asked, "Did you like him?" Emma paused for a moment. She considered telling the truth. She considered saying, "Yes, I did. I was hoping something would grow between us. I stayed silent because I didn't want to complicate things." But instead, she gave a small, calm shrug. "It wasn't anything serious," she replied. And that sentence, simple as it sounded, became a defining emotional defense. Because when emotions are minimized repeatedly, the mind begins to believe that silence prevents emotional risk. Another important life lesson emerges here. When people suppress vulnerable communication to avoid discomfort, they may also unintentionally prevent deeper emotional connections from forming. Emma did not see herself as emotionally closed. She saw herself as emotionally controlled. There is a difference. After graduation, she carried this quiet resilience into adulthood. At work, she was known as reliable and composed. In friendships, she was a good listener, attentive, thoughtful, and rarely reactive. People trusted her. They confided in her. They admired her calmness. But very few people truly knew what she felt internally, because she rarely verbalized emotional uncertainty, unless directly asked. And even then, she often softened her responses. So when she met Daniel 3 years later in that quiet bookstore, something about his presence felt deeply safe. He did not pressure conversations. He did not demand emotional declarations. He did not fill silence with unnecessary words. He simply existed beside her in a way that felt natural. Their connection grew through routine, through shared quiet spaces, through gentle familiarity rather than intense emotional exchanges. To Emma, this felt like the healthiest kind of love. Peaceful, stable, respectful. But here is the educational insight that many people overlook. A relationship built primarily on mutual emotional restraint can feel harmonious, yet still lack proactive communication during moments of uncertainty. Back in the present, Emma sat quietly on the couch, her thoughts drifting between past and present with subtle clarity. She now understood something about herself that she hadn't fully acknowledged before. She did not avoid questions because she was indifferent. She avoided them because her life experiences had taught her that silence preserved emotional stability. Her gaze moved once again toward the kitchen. The receipt remained where it had been placed, unmoved, unaddressed, unexplained. But unlike her younger self in the university library, Emma was no longer the same person who believed that silence was always the safest choice. She had grown, matured, reflected, and maturity often brings awareness of one's emotional patterns. She did not feel jealousy. She did not feel anger. She did not jump to conclusions. Instead, she felt something more nuanced, a quiet emotional distance forming, not because of the receipt itself, but because Daniel had not mentioned it. And that distinction mattered, because in healthy adult relationships, transparency about small things builds emotional trust over time. Silence, even when harmless in intention, can sometimes create unnecessary uncertainty in perception. Emma exhaled slowly, her posture still calm, her expression still composed. But internally, a subtle shift was happening. For the first time in years, she began to question a lifelong belief. Was silence truly protecting peace? Or was it quietly delaying clarity? And as that thought settled into her mind, another life lesson gently emerged. Emotional safety in relationships is not created by the absence of difficult conversations, but by the presence of honest ones delivered with calm understanding. The receipt was still small, still ordinary, still quiet. But now, it was no longer just a symbol of uncertainty. It had become a mirror reflecting something deeper within Emma herself, a lifetime of choosing silence, and a growing awareness that love, if it is to grow stronger, sometimes requires the courage to speak before silence becomes distance. Not everyone learns silence the same way. Some people are raised in quiet homes and grow into calm adults. Others are raised in loud homes and grow into quiet adults as a form of protection. Daniel belonged to the second kind. If Emma's childhood taught her that peace meant staying composed, Daniel's childhood taught him something entirely different. That words, once spoken carelessly, could cause damage that silence might have prevented. His home was never physically unsafe, but it was emotionally loud. Conversations were rarely simple. Disagreements rarely stayed small. And silence, when it came, often arrived only after something hurtful had already been said. From an educational and psychological standpoint, children raised in verbally intense environments often develop one of two patterns. They either become equally expressive, or they become deeply cautious with communication. Daniel became cautious. He was 8 years old when he first noticed how quickly a peaceful evening could change. It started with something small. His mother had asked a simple question about a household expense. His father, tired from work and already mentally burdened, responded with a sharper tone than intended. The conversation escalated, not dramatically at first, but steadily. Voices rose. Interruptions increased. Frustration layered itself into sentences that were never meant to wound. Daniel sat quietly at the dining table, his small hands wrapped around a glass of water, listening. He did not fully understand the topic of the argument, but he understood the emotional impact. The tension in the room felt heavier than the words themselves. And then it happened. A sentence spoken too quickly, too loudly, too emotionally. One careless phrase from his father that made his mother fall silent in a way that was different from usual. Not calm silence, not thoughtful silence, but hurt silence. The kind that lingers, the kind that cannot be easily undone. From a psychological education perspective, this moment is significant. Children do not just remember loud arguments, they remember the emotional aftermath that follows them. That night, no one shouted anymore. The house became quiet. But the quiet did not feel peaceful. It felt heavy. Daniel stayed in his room longer than usual, replaying the sound of raised voices in his mind. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. He simply thought. And children who think deeply in emotionally tense environments often form internal rules to feel safe. Daniel's rule became simple. If words can hurt when spoken in the wrong moment, then it is safer to speak less and think more. As he grew older, this pattern strengthened. At school, teachers described him as thoughtful and well-mannered. He rarely interrupted others. He listened carefully before responding. When conflicts arose between classmates, he often chose to stay quiet rather than take sides. Not because he lacked opinions, but because he believed that unnecessary words could create unnecessary problems. There was another defining moment when he was 12. His parents had another disagreement, this time about something minor, something that should have passed quickly. But exhaustion and stress turned the conversation sharper than intended. Daniel was in the living room, pretending to read while listening. His father, frustrated, said something he immediately regretted. The room fell silent. His mother didn't respond. She simply walked away. And that silence lasted for days. They spoke politely. They functioned normally, but emotionally, something had shifted. From an educational life lesson perspective, prolonged silent tension after verbal conflict can teach children that emotional damage from words lasts longer than the conflict itself. Daniel noticed how different that silence felt compared to ordinary quiet evenings. It was not calm. It was fragile. And for the first time, he made a conscious emotional decision. He would never be the kind of person who spoke recklessly. He would pause. Think. Measure. Because to him, delayed speech felt safer than regretful speech. During his teenage years, this emotional habit became part of his personality. Friends often described him as easy to talk to, but rarely as someone who talked excessively. He asked thoughtful questions, gave measured responses, and avoided heated debates whenever possible. If a disagreement began to escalate, he would lower his tone instead of raising it. If someone became emotional, he would give them space instead of reacting immediately. From a psychological development standpoint, this behavior reflects emotional conflict-avoidant communication, which is often rooted in early exposure to intense verbal environments. Daniel did not fear communication itself. He feared careless communication. There is a difference. At 16, he experienced something that further reinforced his emotional restraint. He had a close friend named Marcus. They had known each other for years and rarely argued. Their friendship was built on mutual respect and shared routines, studying together, playing basketball occasionally, and discussing future plans in quiet conversations. One afternoon, a misunderstanding occurred over something small, a group project decision that Marcus interpreted as exclusion. Marcus confronted him directly, his tone sharper than usual. "You should have just told me," Marcus said. Instead of deciding things quietly, Daniel froze slightly. He had not intended to exclude him. He had simply assumed it wasn't a major decision. "I didn't think it was a big deal," Daniel replied calmly. But Marcus, already frustrated, responded emotionally. "That's the problem. You never say what you're thinking until it's too late." The argument did not escalate loudly, but the emotional impact stayed with Daniel for weeks, not because of the disagreement itself, but because of Marcus's final sentence before walking away. "You think silence keeps things peaceful, but sometimes it just makes people feel shut out." That sentence settled deeply into Daniel's mind. From an educational perspective, this moment introduced a conflicting emotional lesson. Silence can prevent conflict, but it can also prevent understanding. He didn't argue back that day. He didn't defend himself aggressively. Instead, he reflected, because reflection had always been his emotional response to tension. Days later, he apologized, not dramatically, not defensively, but sincerely. "I wasn't ignoring you," he said quietly. "I just didn't realize I should have said more." Marcus eventually understood, and their friendship stabilized again. But the experience left a lasting impression. Daniel realized something important about himself. He was not silent because he didn't care. He was silent because he cared too much about saying the wrong thing. That distinction shaped how he approached relationships in adulthood. When he entered college and later began his professional life, this careful communication style made him appear emotionally stable and reliable. He did not engage in unnecessary drama. He did not react impulsively. He listened more than he spoke. People trusted him easily, but there was a hidden limitation. He often delayed emotional conversations until they felt absolutely necessary. And sometimes, by the time they felt necessary, the other person had already formed their own interpretations. This pattern followed him quietly into his romantic life as well. Before Emma, he had dated briefly, but those relationships never lasted long. Not because of betrayal or incompatibility, but because partners occasionally felt he was emotionally reserved. "You're kind," one former partner once told him, "but it's hard to know what you're thinking, unless I ask directly." He had nodded, understanding her perspective, without fully knowing how to change his instinctive habits. Then, 3 years ago, on a rainy afternoon in a quiet bookstore, he met Emma. And for the first time, his silence was not misunderstood. It was matched. She didn't rush conversations. She didn't demand emotional explanations. She didn't fill quiet moments with unnecessary dialogue. Their connection grew in shared stillness rather than constant conversation. To Daniel, this felt deeply safe. Because with Emma, silence did not feel like tension. It felt like understanding. And here lies a powerful educational insight about relationships. When two emotionally restrained individuals connect, they often experience a strong sense of peace, yet they may unknowingly reinforce each other's habit of avoiding difficult conversations. Back in the present, Daniel sat quietly at his desk at work, his pen hovering above ungraded papers. His mind was not focused on assignments. It was replaying the image of the receipt on the kitchen counter. Small, ordinary, unexplained. He knew he had not hidden it intentionally. He knew he had done nothing wrong. And yet, he also knew something else, something shaped by years of emotional observation. Emma had seen it, and she had not asked, which meant she was thinking. And thinking, when combined with silence, often creates emotional distance if clarity is delayed too long. He leaned back slightly in his chair and exhaled slowly. For the first time since finding the receipt on the counter, he began to question his lifelong communication habit. Was waiting for the right moment truly considerate, or was it simply another form of emotional delay? Because deep down, he understood a truth he had learned since childhood: words spoken recklessly can hurt, but words withheld for too long can quietly create misunderstandings. And now, without raising her voice, without accusing him, without even asking a direct question, Emma's silence was gently confronting the very habit he had relied on his entire life. There are people who avoid difficult conversations because they do not care enough. And there are people who avoid them because they care too much about saying the wrong thing. Daniel had always belonged to the second group. But he did not fully recognize how deeply that habit affected his relationships until his late 20s. long before Emma ever walked into his life. His first serious relationship had been with a woman named Claire. She was expressive, warm, and emotionally articulate in ways that Daniel quietly admired. Where he paused before speaking, she spoke with clarity. Where he reflected internally, she processed her emotions out loud. At first, their differences felt balanced. She brought energy into conversations. He brought calm into disagreements. She encouraged openness. He offered stability. From an educational perspective, relationships between expressive and reserved individuals can work beautifully if both partners actively communicate their emotional needs. But if those needs remain unspoken, imbalance slowly forms. Claire often shared stories about her day in detail, describing not just events, but how those events made her feel. Daniel listened attentively, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and responded gently. He was present. He was kind. He was consistent. And yet, there was something missing that neither of them addressed immediately. One evening, after several months of dating, Claire asked a simple question while they were walking home from dinner. "What do you feel when you're upset?" she asked. Daniel blinked slightly, caught off guard by the directness. "I think about it," he replied calmly. She smiled a little. "I know you think about things, but do you talk about them?" He hesitated. That hesitation, though small, revealed a deeper emotional truth. "I usually wait until it feels necessary," he admitted. Claire nodded slowly, but her expression carried quiet concern. This moment highlights an important life lesson. Some people believe emotional timing should be intuitive, while others believe emotional communication should be proactive. When those approaches differ, misunderstandings can arise even in otherwise healthy relationships. Months passed, and small patterns began to repeat. If something bothered Claire, she addressed it directly. If something bothered Daniel, he processed it privately first, not to hide, not to avoid, but to ensure that when he finally spoke, his words would be measured and fair. However, emotional delays can sometimes be misinterpreted as emotional distance. One particular evening changed the tone of their relationship. They had planned to attend a small gathering with mutual friends. Claire had been looking forward to it all week, but earlier that day, Daniel experienced unexpected stress at work that left him mentally drained. Instead of communicating this immediately, he told himself he would see how he felt later. By the time evening arrived, his exhaustion had deepened. "Are you ready?" Claire asked, adjusting her coat. Daniel paused near the doorway. "I think I might stay in tonight," he said quietly. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. "You knew about this all week," she replied gently. "I know," he said. "I just didn't realize how tired I'd feel today." She nodded, but the silence that followed felt heavier than usual. After a few seconds, she asked, "Why didn't you tell me earlier that you were feeling overwhelmed?" Daniel's answer came honestly. "I didn't want to disappoint you if I ended up feeling fine." From a psychological standpoint, this response reflects a common communication pattern, avoiding early expression of discomfort to preserve harmony. But Claire saw it differently. "You think waiting protects people," she said softly. "But sometimes it just makes them feel unprepared." That sentence stayed with him, not as criticism, but as insight. He had never intended to create emotional distance. He had simply believed that silence until certainty was considerate. As time went on, similar situations occurred, not dramatic conflicts, not arguments filled with shouting, but quiet misunderstandings rooted in delayed communication. Claire never accused him of being dishonest. She never doubted his kindness, but she did struggle with one recurring feeling. "I wish I knew what was on your mind sooner," she told him one evening. "Not after you've already processed everything alone." Daniel listened carefully, as he always did. He understood her perspective logically, but emotionally, changing his instinctive response pattern was not easy, because his entire life had taught him that speaking too soon could create unnecessary tension. Eventually, the relationship ended, not with anger, not with betrayal, but with calm honesty. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, much like he and Emma would years later in different contexts. Claire's voice was gentle. "You are one of the kindest people I've ever met," she said. "But sometimes, it feels like you carry your thoughts alone until they become too heavy to share." Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, reflecting on her words. "I don't mean to," he replied. "I know," she said softly. "And that's why this is difficult. You're not emotionally unavailable, you're emotionally careful. But careful can sometimes feel distant." That distinction struck him deeply. Not emotionally unavailable, emotionally careful. From an educational and relational psychology perspective, this difference is crucial. Many individuals who appear reserved in communication are not lacking emotional depth. They are managing their emotional expression with caution shaped by past experiences. Claire continued gently, "I don't need constant explanations. I just need to feel included in your thoughts before silence builds its own meaning." They parted respectfully that day. No raised voices, no resentment, just quiet understanding. And another emotional lesson quietly stored in Daniel's memory. Silence may prevent conflict, but it can also unintentionally prevent emotional closeness. After that relationship, Daniel did not become more expressive overnight, but he did become more aware. He noticed how often he paused before sharing thoughts, how frequently he delayed small explanations because they felt unnecessary, how easily silence filled spaces where a simple clarification could have prevented uncertainty. Still, habits shaped over decades rarely disappear quickly. Then came the rainy afternoon at the bookstore. The first time he saw Emma, she was standing near the poetry section, flipping through a book with quiet focus. She did not seem rushed. She did not seem distracted. She simply existed in the space with a calm presence that felt immediately familiar. Their first interaction was simple, a shared glance, a small smile, a quiet moment reaching for the same book, and what surprised him most was not her appearance or her voice. It was her comfort with silence. She did not rush to fill pauses. She did not ask excessive questions. She did not interpret quiet moments as awkward. With her, silence felt natural, safe, balanced. From an educational standpoint, individuals often feel strongest compatibility with partners whose communication styles mirror their own emotional conditioning. Emma's quiet composure aligned perfectly with Daniel's careful restraint. Their early dates were filled with gentle conversations, long walks, and shared quiet spaces that never felt uncomfortable. They could sit in the same cafe for an hour, speaking intermittently, and still feel deeply connected. For the first time in his life, Daniel did not feel pressured to explain every internal thought immediately, and that relief strengthened his emotional attachment to her. But here lies the subtle psychological complexity. When both partners are comfortable with silence, unresolved issues may take longer to surface because neither partner naturally initiates difficult conversations early. Back in the present, Daniel sat in his car outside their apartment building, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The engine was off. The evening air was still, and his mind was unusually active. He thought about Claire's words, about his childhood memories, about Emma's silence over the past 2 days. Emma had not accused him. She had not questioned him directly. She had not changed her behavior dramatically. But she had grown quieter, and, to Daniel, quiet shifts in behavior were more significant than loud reactions. Because he understood quiet people, he was one. He replayed the moment she picked up the receipt the night before. Her steady hands, her calm expression, her lack of immediate questions. That was not indifference. That was processing. And processing, when combined with emotional restraint, could easily lead to internal conclusions if clarity was delayed too long. He exhaled slowly and leaned back in his seat. For the first time, he began to connect all the educational lessons life had taught him. His childhood taught him to avoid reckless words. His past relationship taught him that delayed communication can feel like distance. And now, his present relationship was quietly reflecting those same patterns back to him. Not through conflict, not through accusation, but through silence. And perhaps the most important life lesson he was beginning to understand was this: careful communication is valuable, but emotional transparency at the right time is equally essential for trust. The receipt itself was harmless. He knew that. But the silence surrounding it was no longer harmless if it continued. Because in relationships built on quiet understanding, even small unexplained moments can slowly reshape emotional perception. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the apartment entrance with measured steps, not anxious, not defensive, but thoughtful. For the first time since the receipt appeared on the counter, Daniel was no longer only concerned about saying the wrong thing. He was beginning to realize that saying nothing at all might quietly create the very misunderstanding he had spent his entire life trying to prevent. Long before the receipt ever touched the kitchen counter, before silence carried questions, before emotional distance even had a chance to exist, their love began in the quietest way possible, not with a grand confession, not with dramatic attraction, not with intense conversations that lasted all night. It began with routine. And from an educational perspective, routine-based bonding is one of the most stable foundations for long-term relationships, because it builds familiarity, emotional safety, and trust through consistent presence rather than emotional intensity. The first time Daniel noticed Emma, it was raining. Not heavily. Just a steady, gentle rain that made the bookstore windows glow softly under the grey afternoon sky. He had been sitting near the back corner, grading papers as usual. Thursday afternoons were always the same for him. Same seat, same quiet environment, same cup of dark coffee placed beside a small stack of documents. Predictability brought him comfort. He preferred environments where noise was minimal and conversations were optional. That day he glanced up briefly when the small bell above the bookstore door chimed. Emma walked in quietly, closing her umbrella with careful movements so as not to drip water across the wooden floor. She paused near the entrance, scanning the shelves with calm curiosity rather than urgency. She did not rush. She did not check her phone. She simply existed in the space with quiet awareness. That was the first thing he noticed. From a psychological perspective, people who are emotionally observant are often drawn to individuals who move with calm intentionality. It signals emotional stability without needing verbal confirmation. Emma moved toward the poetry section. Daniel returned to grading his papers. At least, he tried to. A few minutes later, he stood up to return a book to the same shelf where Emma was browsing. Their hands reached for the same book at nearly the same time. Their fingers brushed lightly. Both of them paused, then looked up, and smiled. It was not an exaggerated smile, not flirtatious, not awkward, just warm, polite, genuine. "You can take it," Emma said softly, withdrawing her hand slightly. Daniel shook his head. "It looks like you found it first." She glanced at the cover briefly, then back at him. "You were reaching for it too." A small silence followed, not uncomfortable, not tense, just present. And that silence did something unexpected. It felt natural. Most first interactions between strangers are filled with quick explanations, unnecessary words, or polite small talk to fill space. But in that moment, neither of them felt the need to rush conversation. That subtle alignment in communication style created an immediate sense of ease. From an educational relationship standpoint, initial compatibility is often rooted less in shared interests and more in shared emotional pacing. Do you read poetry often? Daniel asked after a brief pause. Sometimes, Emma replied. When I want to slow my thoughts. He nodded slightly. That makes sense. Another small pause. Then she gave a faint smile and added, It's one of the few things that doesn't demand immediate understanding. That sentence stayed with him long after their conversation ended, because it reflected something he had always felt but rarely expressed. They spoke for only a few more minutes that afternoon. Nothing dramatic, nothing deeply personal, just small exchanges about books, quiet spaces, and the comfort of routines. Before leaving, Emma nodded politely and said, Have a good evening. You too, Daniel replied, and that was it. No exchange of numbers, no immediate plans, no forced continuation, just a quiet encounter. Yet something about it lingered in his mind more than he expected. The following Thursday, he returned to the bookstore at the same time, not intentionally hoping to see her. At least, that was what he told himself. He ordered his usual coffee, sat in his usual seat, and began grading papers again. 10 minutes later, the bell above the door chimed. Emma walked in. Same calm posture, same quiet awareness, same gentle presence. She noticed him almost immediately and gave a small nod of recognition before heading toward the poetry section again. This time, their interaction felt slightly more natural. Not because anything had changed dramatically, but because familiarity had been established. From a psychological and educational perspective, repeated low-pressure interactions strengthen emotional comfort more effectively than intense early connections. Back for more poetry? Daniel asked lightly when she passed by his table. Emma smiled faintly. Back for the quiet, she replied. He gestured slightly toward the empty chair across from him. You're welcome to sit, if you'd like. She hesitated for only a second, before nodding. And just like that, a new routine began. At first, they sat together in silence more than they spoke. Emma read her books. Daniel graded papers. Occasionally, they exchanged brief comments about a line from a poem or a passage from a book. Their conversations were soft, measured, unforced, and surprisingly, neither of them felt the need to fill every silence. This was rare, because many people interpret silence in early interactions as awkwardness. But for Emma and Daniel, silence felt like shared space rather than social pressure. Over the next few weeks, this pattern repeated consistently. Thursday afternoon, bookstore, corner table, quiet companionship. They did not officially plan these meetings. They simply showed up. And consistency slowly transformed coincidence into routine. From an educational life lesson perspective, routine interaction creates emotional trust because it signals reliability without needing verbal promises. One afternoon, Daniel arrived slightly later than usual. For the first time, Emma was already seated at the table. He paused briefly, surprised. You're early today, he said. I had less work, she replied calmly. Then, after a small pause, she added, I wasn't sure if you'd be here. That simple sentence carried more meaning than it appeared to. Not expectation, not dependency, just acknowledgement of a pattern that had quietly formed. Daniel placed his papers down and smiled slightly. I usually am, and he was. From that day forward, their routine extended beyond the bookstore. Occasionally, they walked out together when the shop closed. Their walks were slow, unhurried, and filled with soft conversations about ordinary topics. Daily routines, favorite quiet places, and the comfort of predictable schedules. Weeks passed before physical affection entered the equation, not out of hesitation, but out of emotional pacing. One evening, while crossing the street during one of their usual walks, Emma hesitated slightly as a car approached the intersection faster than expected. Daniel reached for her hand instinctively. Their fingers intertwined for only a few seconds, then separated naturally once they reached the sidewalk. Neither of them commented on it, but both of them noticed how natural it felt. From a psychological standpoint, physical gestures that emerge organically during shared routines often create stronger emotional bonds than dramatic displays of affection. Their relationship did not feel intense. It felt steady, and steady felt safe. Months later, when they finally went on what could officially be called a date, it did not look different from their usual routine. They visited a quiet cafe, ordered simple meals, and spoke in the same gentle tone they always used. At one point, Emma asked a question that reflected her reflective nature. Do you ever feel like silence can be comforting? She asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. Yes, he replied. When it's shared. She nodded, as if that answer confirmed something she already believed. That moment marked an emotional turning point. Because it revealed a core compatibility. They both valued calm emotional environments. They both respected thoughtful communication. And most importantly, they both saw silence as a form of understanding rather than avoidance. From an educational relationship perspective, this kind of emotional alignment creates strong long-term stability, but it can also delay the expression of difficult conversations if both partners rely heavily on nonverbal understanding. Their first I love you did not arrive during a dramatic moment. It happened quietly one evening while sitting on the couch, reading separate books with their legs lightly touching. Emma closed her book first. I think I feel safe with you, she said softly. Daniel looked up. "I feel the same," he replied. A small pause followed. Then, almost naturally, he added, "I love you." She blinked slightly, surprised not by the words, but by how calmly they were spoken. "I love you too," she said gently. No dramatic music, no emotional outburst, no grand declarations, just quiet sincerity. And in that quiet, their love took root, steady, peaceful, and deeply comfortable. But here lies the subtle educational truth. Relationships built on routine and quiet understanding often feel the most stable. Yet they also require intentional communication during moments of uncertainty to prevent silent misunderstandings. Because while routine builds trust, unspoken questions can slowly reshape emotional perception if left unaddressed. And now, 3 years later, back in the present, that same quiet love, once strengthened by routine and silence, was facing its first real test. Not through loud conflict, not through betrayal, but through a small, ordinary receipt resting silently on a kitchen counter. If someone had asked Emma to describe her relationship with Daniel in one word before the receipt appeared on the counter, she would have said, peaceful. Not exciting, not dramatic, not overwhelming. Peaceful. And for many people, especially those raised in emotionally intense environments, peaceful love feels like the highest form of security. Their relationship did not evolve through sudden milestones. It unfolded gradually through the accumulation of small, consistent moments that quietly strengthened their bond. From an educational perspective, this kind of slow-burn emotional development often leads to deeper long-term stability because it is built on familiarity rather than temporary emotional highs. Their apartment, shared for nearly 2 years now, reflected that same quiet harmony. Soft lighting, neutral colors, books neatly arranged on shelves, a small dining table by the window where they ate most of their meals. Nothing excessive, nothing chaotic, everything intentional. Mornings followed a predictable rhythm. Emma woke first most days, not because she had to, but because her body preferred gentle beginnings. She would prepare tea, open the curtains slightly to let in natural light, and move through the kitchen with calm, unhurried movements. Daniel usually woke shortly after, guided more by routine than alarm clocks. He rarely spoke immediately in the morning, and Emma never pressured him to. This mutual understanding created a subtle but powerful emotional safety. "Good morning," she would say softly. "Morning," he would reply, often with a faint smile. No forced conversation, no unnecessary questions, just presence. Educationally, shared routines reduce emotional friction in relationships because they create predictable emotional environments where both partners feel secure. Evenings carried their own rituals. After work, Daniel would place his keys in the same bowl near the door. Emma would often be on the couch, reading or folding laundry. Sometimes the television played quietly in the background, more for atmosphere than entertainment. Their conversations about the day were calm and measured. "How was work?" "Busy, but manageable." "How about yours?" Steady, simple exchanges. But beneath that simplicity was genuine attentiveness. They listened. They observed. They remembered small details about each other's schedules, preferences, and moods, without needing to ask repeatedly. One of their most cherished routines was Thursday evenings, the day that had originally connected them at the bookstore. Even after moving in together, they continued to honor that quiet tradition by spending Thursday nights reading side by side in the living room. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. And yet, the silence never felt empty. It felt shared. From a psychological standpoint, comfortable silence in relationships often signals emotional trust. It reflects a belief that connection does not always require constant verbal affirmation. One night, about a year into living together, a heavy storm knocked out the electricity in their neighborhood. The apartment fell into darkness, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. Emma lit a candle and placed it on the coffee table. Daniel sat beside her, listening to the sound of rain against the windows. "This is oddly calming," she said softly. He nodded. "It's quiet." She smiled faintly. "It's always quiet with us." He paused for a moment before replying. "I think that's why it works." That statement carried a quiet truth. Their relationship worked because neither of them demanded emotional expressions the other struggled to give. They communicated through gestures, presence, and consistency, rather than constant verbal reassurances. When Emma was stressed, Daniel would notice subtle signs, slower movements, quieter responses, and he would make tea without asking if she wanted some. When Daniel felt mentally overwhelmed, Emma would give him space without interpreting it as distance. These small acts formed the emotional language of their relationship, and that language was deeply effective. But here lies an important educational insight. When couples rely primarily on non-verbal emotional understanding, they may become less practiced at addressing direct uncertainties verbally. This does not weaken love, but it can create blind spots. For example, they rarely argued, not because they never disagreed, but because disagreements were handled gently, often through delayed conversations that remained calm and brief. If Emma felt bothered by something small, like Daniel working late without notice, she would mention it later in a composed tone. "If you're going to stay late, could you text me?" she once said softly. Daniel nodded immediately. "I should have done that. I'll remember next time." And he did. No raised voices. No emotional escalation. Just resolution. From a life education perspective, this demonstrates healthy conflict management, calm, respectful, and solution-oriented. However, Not all issues are as simple as scheduling misunderstandings. Some emotional moments require timely clarification rather than delayed calmness, and that was the area where their relationship had never truly been tested. Another defining aspect of their life together was physical affection, subtle, natural, and unforced. Emma often leaned lightly against Daniel's shoulder while reading. Daniel occasionally reached for her hand during quiet walks. Their gestures were gentle rather than expressive. To outsiders, their relationship might have appeared understated, but internally, it felt deeply secure. "I like how peaceful we are," Emma once said during a quiet dinner. Daniel looked up from his plate. "Peace is underrated," he replied. She smiled. Most people confuse drama with passion. He considered that carefully before responding. Stability is its own form of passion. That sentence stayed with her, because it captured the essence of their bond. Their love was not loud. It was steady, and steady felt dependable. Yet, even in the most stable relationships, emotional patterns from childhood and past experiences remain present beneath the surface. Emma's habit: process internally before asking questions. Daniel's habit: delay explanations until they felt necessary. Individually, these habits were harmless. Together, they created a quiet vulnerability, because when uncertainty finally appeared, like the unexpected receipt, both of them instinctively returned to their lifelong coping mechanisms. She observed silently. He waited silently. And routine, once a source of comfort, began to carry subtle tension. Back in the present timeline, the apartment still looked exactly the same. The same couch, the same soft lighting, the same quiet atmosphere. But emotional perception had shifted slightly. Emma still prepared meals. Daniel still followed his routines. They still sat beside each other in the evenings. Yet, something small had changed. She no longer reached for his hand first. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just subtly. From an educational psychological standpoint, micro-behavioral shifts often signal internal emotional processing before verbal communication occurs. Daniel noticed. He noticed how she asked about his day later than usual, how her pauses lasted a second longer, how her silence, though still calm, felt more reflective than relaxed. And Emma noticed things too. How he glanced at the counter occasionally, how he seemed slightly more thoughtful when entering the kitchen, how his usual quiet confidence carried a hint of internal deliberation. Neither of them felt anger, neither of them felt distrust, but both of them felt the presence of something unspoken. One evening, as they sat side by side on the couch watching a quiet documentary, their knees brushed lightly. Emma noticed. She didn't pull away, but she also didn't lean closer as she usually did, not out of resentment, but out of contemplation, because internally a question had begun to form, not about the receipt itself, but about the silence surrounding it. And that distinction was crucial. From an educational relationship perspective, unresolved small uncertainties can create emotional distance, not because of their severity, but because of the meaning partners assigned to the lack of explanation. Emma did not assume betrayal. She assumed thoughtfulness. But she also wondered why something so simple had not been mentioned naturally. Daniel, on the other hand, believed he was protecting peace by waiting for the right moment to explain. Two calm people, two thoughtful minds, one unspoken situation, and routine, which once strengthened their bond, was now quietly holding space for a conversation neither had initiated yet. As the documentary played softly in the background, Emma's eyes drifted briefly toward the kitchen counter. The receipt was still there, small, folded, unremarkable in appearance, yet emotionally significant in presence. She exhaled slowly, leaning back into the couch with composed stillness. And in that moment, another life lesson gently surfaced within her awareness. Routine can sustain love, but clarity sustains emotional trust. Because even the most peaceful relationships are not defined by the absence of tension, but by how gently and honestly uncertainty is addressed when it finally appears. There is a kind of silence that feels warm, not empty, not distant, not uncomfortable, but protective. For years, Emma and Daniel lived inside that kind of silence without ever questioning it. Their home was not loud, and it was never emotionally chaotic. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations that left emotional scars behind. Instead, there was consistency, routine, a quiet emotional rhythm that made their relationship feel stable in ways many couples longed for. And stability, from an educational and psychological standpoint, is one of the strongest foundations of long-term love. But stability without intentional communication can slowly become emotional complacency if left unexamined. The days following the discovery of the receipt unfolded with the same outward normalcy that had always defined their life together. Emma still woke early. She still prepared her tea with careful movements, letting the steam rise slowly as morning light filtered through the curtains. The kitchen remained peaceful, filled only with the soft sounds of boiling water and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Daniel still followed his routine as well. Keys in the bowl, coffee poured without excess noise, measured steps across the floor. From an outsider's perspective, nothing had changed. But internally, both of them were thinking more than usual. And thinking, when paired with silence, can create emotional layers that remain invisible unless spoken aloud. Emma stood near the sink that morning, rinsing her cup slowly. Her movements were not rushed, not distracted, just slightly more deliberate than usual. She did not look toward the counter immediately. but she was aware of it. Awareness without acknowledgement is a subtle form of emotional processing. From a psychological education perspective, emotionally composed individuals often delay direct confrontation, not because they are avoiding truth, but because they are organizing their thoughts carefully before speaking. She dried her hands and finally allowed her gaze to drift toward the receipt. Still folded, still untouched, still present, a small object, a growing emotional symbol, not because of what it proved, but because of what it represented, an unexplained detail in an otherwise transparent routine. "Do you have a busy day today?" Emma asked softly as Daniel entered the kitchen. Her tone was calm, natural, but Daniel noticed something. She was asking routine questions exactly as she always did, yet there was a slight pause before each sentence, as though her thoughts were moving more cautiously than usual. "I have a few meetings," he replied. "Nothing unusual." She nodded. "That sounds manageable." Another pause. Gentle, familiar, and yet subtly heavier. Here lies an important life lesson about emotional communication. When something small remains unaddressed, conversations do not necessarily become tense. Instead, they often become more careful. Careful words, careful tones, careful pauses. Not because love is weakening, but because uncertainty is quietly occupying mental space. Daniel reached for his coffee mug and hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing it on the counter, slightly further away from the receipt than usual. It was an unconscious action. But Emma noticed. Quiet people often notice small behavioral shifts long before verbal ones. She did not comment on it. Instead, she took a sip of her tea and moved toward the window. Outside, the morning was ordinary. People walked along the sidewalk. A distant car passed by. The world remained unaffected by the quiet emotional complexity unfolding inside their apartment. Routine continued throughout the day. Emma completed her work from home with the same discipline she always had. Emails answered, tasks organized, breaks taken at consistent intervals. She even played soft instrumental music in the background, just as she usually did when focusing. But there was a difference in her internal state. Her mind revisited the same question intermittently, not obsessively, not emotionally, but thoughtfully. Why didn't he mention it? Not, what does it mean? Not, was he hiding something? Just a simple, reflective curiosity shaped by emotional maturity. From an educational relationship standpoint, emotionally secure individuals rarely jump to extreme conclusions. Instead, they evaluate patterns, context, and consistency before forming judgments. Daniel had always been consistent, honest, predictable, thoughtful, which was precisely why the absence of a simple explanation felt more noticeable than the receipt itself. Later that afternoon, Emma folded laundry in the living room, her movements slow and precise. Folding, like many routine tasks, helped her think without overthinking. Each shirt folded neatly, each towel stacked evenly. Structure outside often helps create clarity inside. She paused briefly, holding one of Daniel's shirts. It still carried the faint scent of his usual cologne, subtle, familiar, comforting. And that familiarity reminded her of something important. Trust is not built on grand gestures. It is built on consistent patterns over time. And Daniel had never given her a reason to distrust him, which meant her emotional discomfort was not rooted in suspicion. It was rooted in silence. That distinction mattered deeply. Back at his workplace, Daniel experienced a similar internal pattern. He sat at his desk reviewing documents, yet his concentration drifted more frequently than usual. His mind returned to the same image again and again, the receipt resting quietly on the counter, unchanged since the night it appeared. He had not hidden it. He had not lied. And yet, he had not explained it either. From a psychological standpoint, this reveals a subtle but important communication dynamic. When individuals believe something is too small to mention, they may unintentionally create uncertainty if the other person notices it first. Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He was not afraid of Emma's reaction. He was afraid of unnecessary emotional disruption. His lifelong habit resurfaced instinctively. If it is harmless, explaining it later will be fine. But another thought followed, one shaped by past experiences and quiet reflections. Later sometimes becomes heavier than sooner. That realization lingered longer than he expected. Meanwhile, back at home, the evening approached with the same familiar rhythm. Emma began preparing dinner, chopping vegetables with steady movements. The sound of the knife against the cutting board filled the kitchen with soft, repetitive noise. Routine again. Stability again. But emotional awareness had deepened. When Daniel returned home, he paused briefly at the doorway as he always did, removing his shoes and placing his keys in the bowl. His eyes instinctively glanced toward the counter. The receipt was still there, unmoved. He swallowed lightly, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. Silence had now extended across multiple days. And extended silence, even in peaceful relationships, can slowly create emotional weight if clarity is postponed too long. "Dinner smells good," he said gently. Emma turned slightly and gave a small smile. "I made something simple." Their eyes met briefly. And in that moment, both of them understood something unspoken. The atmosphere was still calm, still respectful, still loving, but no longer entirely light. They ate dinner together, as they always did. Plates placed carefully, water glasses filled, soft conversation about daily tasks and schedules. Yet beneath the surface of their normal routine existed a quiet awareness shared by both of them. Not tension, not conflict, but anticipation. Because emotionally mature individuals often sense when a conversation is approaching, even before it begins. After dinner, Emma washed the dishes while Daniel wiped the counter. Their movements were coordinated, practiced and gentle. Then it happened. For the first time since the receipt appeared, Emma's hand moved closer to it while drying the surface. She did not pick it up immediately. She simply rested her fingers near it for a second longer than usual. And in that small gesture lay a powerful educational truth. Silence can feel safe in the short term, but prolonged silence around uncertainty gradually transforms safety into emotional distance. Daniel noticed her hand pause. And for the first time, the familiar comfort of silence no longer felt entirely protective. It felt delayed. And delay, when it comes to emotional clarity, often reshapes how moments are interpreted. Emma finally withdrew her hand and placed the dish towel neatly beside the sink. Still calm, still composed, still thoughtful. But internally, she was no longer simply observing the situation. She was beginning to understand that the real issue was not the receipt itself. It was how long two emotionally careful people could remain silent about something small, before that silence quietly started to matter more than the truth behind it. By the fourth day, the receipt had stopped being just an object. It had become a presence, not intrusive, not dramatic, not openly acknowledged, but present in a way that subtly shaped the emotional atmosphere of the apartment. And that, from an educational and psychological perspective, is how unspoken tension usually develops in emotionally mature relationships, not through sudden conflict, but through prolonged quiet awareness. Nothing outwardly changed in their routines. Emma still woke early. Daniel still followed his schedule. Meals were still shared. Conversations were still polite and gentle. Yet something small had shifted, not in what they said, but in how they existed around each other. Emma noticed it first in herself. She no longer reached for Daniel's hand automatically when they crossed the living room together. Not intentionally, not consciously. Her body simply paused where it once moved freely. Physical habits, like emotional ones, often respond to internal uncertainty before the mind fully processes why. One evening, while watching television, their shoulders rested close but not touching. The distance was minimal, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Emma was aware of it. And awareness changes perception. She did not feel anger. She did not feel resentment. She did not feel suspicion. What she felt was restraint. The same quiet restraint she had practiced her entire life, whenever something emotional required careful thought. From a life education standpoint, this is a crucial distinction. Emotional distance does not always come from conflict. Sometimes, it comes from prolonged internal processing. Daniel noticed the change as well. He noticed how she still smiled at him, but slightly less often. How her responses remained warm, yet slightly shorter. How her pauses between sentences lasted just a fraction longer than usual. To most people, these changes would seem insignificant. To Daniel, they were deeply noticeable, because he had always been attentive to subtle emotional shifts. At dinner that night, Emma asked about his day as she always did. "How were your meetings?" she asked softly. "Productive," he replied. "A bit long, but manageable." She nodded. "That's good." Another pause followed. Not uncomfortable, but reflective. Normally she would have asked a follow-up question, something small about a colleague or a detail he mentioned. Tonight, she didn't. Not because she lacked interest, but because her mind was partially occupied by something unresolved. And here lies an important educational truth about human behavior. When the mind is processing unanswered questions, even normal interactions become more reserved, not less caring. Daniel set his fork down gently and glanced toward the kitchen counter for the briefest moment. The receipt was still there, folded, quiet, unaddressed. He looked back at Emma, who was calmly finishing her meal. She was not avoiding him. She was not acting distant in any obvious way, but she was thinking. And thinking, when paired with silence, often creates emotional space. After dinner, they moved into their usual evening routine. Emma washed the dishes, while Daniel dried them. Their coordination remained smooth, practiced over years of shared domestic life. "You can leave the rest," Daniel said quietly. "I'll finish them." Emma shook her head gently. "It's all right. It won't take long." Her tone was kind, but her words were more functional than usual. Another subtle shift. From an educational psychology perspective, emotionally composed individuals often become more task-focused when navigating internal uncertainty. It provides structure while their thoughts organize themselves. Later that evening, they sat on the couch, as they often did on weeknights. A documentary played softly in the background, its narration low and steady. Emma held a book in her lap, but had not turned a page in several minutes, Daniel noticed. He also noticed something else. She leaned back into the couch, but not against his shoulder the way she usually did. Not deliberately, just slightly apart. He exhaled slowly, his chest tightening with a quiet realization. The silence was no longer neutral. It was shaping behavior. This is a powerful life lesson in relationships. Unspoken uncertainty rarely explodes into arguments in emotionally mature couples. Instead, it subtly alters closeness, routines, and natural gestures. Emma closed her book gently. The soft sound drew Daniel's attention immediately. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Neither of them looked away, but neither of them spoke either. And in that shared gaze existed a silent acknowledgement. Something was present between them, even if unnamed. Emma broke eye contact first, turning her attention back to the television. Not as avoidance, but as delay, because she was still deciding whether the situation required a conversation or simply time. Her upbringing had always taught her that small things often resolve themselves if left undisturbed. But adulthood had begun to teach her something more complex. Not all silence leads to resolution. Some silence leads to interpretation. Meanwhile, Daniel's internal reflections were becoming harder to ignore. He replayed the past few days carefully. She had not accused him. She had not questioned him directly. She had not changed her behavior dramatically. Yet her emotional rhythm had shifted in subtle ways that only someone deeply familiar with her could notice. And he was deeply familiar with her. He remembered how she used to hum softly while making tea. She hadn't done that in days. He remembered how she often rested her hand lightly over his when sitting beside him. That habit had paused without explanation. He remembered how her pauses used to feel relaxed. Now they felt thoughtful. And that difference mattered. From an educational relationship standpoint, familiarity allows partners to detect emotional changes long before verbal communication begins. Emma stood up after a while and walked into the kitchen to refill her water glass. She paused briefly near the counter. Her eyes moved toward the receipt again. This time, she picked it up. Not abruptly, not emotionally, just calmly. She unfolded it, read the printed lines once more, and observed the details with quiet composure. Restaurant name, 2 entrees, 2 desserts, date, 2 nights before she found it. Her expression remained steady, because her thoughts were not spiraling into assumptions. They were analyzing patterns. Daniel had never hidden his schedule. He had never shown secrecy. He had never behaved inconsistently. Which meant the emotional discomfort she felt was not about distrust. It was about unexplained absence of information, and that, psychologically, is very different. She folded the receipt again and placed it back on the counter exactly where it had been. Carefully, respectfully, as if acknowledging its presence without assigning it emotional drama. When she returned to the living room, Daniel looked at her briefly, then back at the television. Neither of them mentioned what she had just done, but the moment did not go unnoticed. Silence, once protective, was now becoming heavier. Not suffocating, not tense, but significant. Emma sat down again, this time a little closer than before, but still not leaning against him. Progress, restraint, balance. And in that quiet adjustment, another educational insight surfaced. Emotionally mature individuals often move toward resolution slowly, not through confrontation, but through increased awareness of emotional distance. After a few minutes, Daniel spoke softly. "Did you like the documentary?" Emma blinked slightly, then nodded. "Yes. It's thoughtful." Another pause. Then she added, gently, "It talks a lot about how small environmental changes affect behavior over time." Daniel swallowed lightly. He understood the deeper meaning behind her words, even though she had not directly referenced their situation. She was not accusing, she was reflecting. And reflection, in emotionally intelligent relationships, often precedes honest communication. He leaned back slightly, his mind finally reaching a quiet conclusion he could no longer ignore. The receipt itself was not the issue. The silence surrounding it was beginning to reshape their emotional rhythm. And for the first time in days, he realized something with complete clarity. By waiting for the right moment, he might have unintentionally allowed a small, harmless detail to grow into an emotionally significant silence. Emma, on the other hand, was realizing something equally important. Her lifelong habit of waiting for clarity without asking questions was no longer feeling entirely protective. It was beginning to feel incomplete, and between two calm, thoughtful people who deeply respected peace. A quiet truth was slowly forming. Silence can feel like safety in the beginning, but when it lingers too long around unanswered moments, it gently transforms into emotional distance that neither person ever intended to create. Let me pause here and ask you something important. Have you ever been in a peaceful relationship where nothing was technically wrong, but something still felt slightly different? If you've ever experienced quiet emotional distance like this, comment "I understand" below. Your experience might help someone else realize they're not alone. By the 6th day, the silence had changed shape. It was no longer soft in the way it used to be. No longer simply peaceful. No longer just shared stillness that felt comforting and familiar. It had become aware, not loud, not tense, but aware of itself. And that awareness, from a psychological and educational standpoint, is often the moment when emotional distance begins to form in otherwise healthy relationships. Nothing dramatic had happened. No arguments, no accusations, no cold shoulders or raised voices. Only a small, ordinary receipt, and the silence that had grown around it. Emma noticed the change most clearly in the mornings. Morning used to be their lightest time of day. Soft greetings, quiet tea, gentle routines that unfolded without effort. But now, even though their actions remained the same, their internal attentiveness to each other had increased. She poured hot water into her cup, watching the steam rise slowly. Usually she hummed while making tea. She didn't realize she had stopped until the quiet lingered longer than usual. Daniel, standing near the counter preparing his coffee, noticed it immediately. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed, because emotional familiarity makes even the smallest behavioral shifts feel significant. From an educational life perspective, long-term partners develop an internal map of each other's habits. When a familiar habit disappears, even something as small as humming, it signals internal emotional processing. Did you sleep well? Emma asked softly, her tone steady. I did, Daniel replied. You? She nodded. Yes. Simple exchange, normal words, calm delivery. Yet beneath the surface, both of them were listening more carefully than before, not just to what was said, but to how it was said. Emma picked up her tea and walked toward the window. She did not look at the counter, but she knew the receipt was still there. Awareness had become constant now, not intrusive, just present in the background of her thoughts like a quiet question, waiting patiently. Why hasn't he mentioned it? Not with suspicion, not with accusation, but with reflective curiosity. This distinction is essential from an educational standpoint. Emotionally mature individuals do not immediately assume the worst. They first observe patterns, consistency and context before forming conclusions. Daniel had always been consistent, which was why the absence of a simple explanation felt more noticeable than the receipt itself. Meanwhile, Daniel stirred his coffee slowly, his mind more occupied than he allowed his expression to show. He had replayed the past few days repeatedly. Her steady tone, her unchanged routines, her subtle physical distance, her longer pauses. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was meaningful, because quiet shifts often speak louder than emotional reactions in calm relationships. He glanced briefly toward the counter. The receipt remained folded exactly where it had been placed days ago, unmoved, untouched, unspoken, and now, undeniably significant. From a psychological communication perspective, the longer a neutral issue remains unaddressed, the more emotional meaning the silence surrounding it begins to carry, even if the issue itself is harmless. Emma turned from the window and walked toward the sink, rinsing her cup with the same careful movement she always had. Routine was still functioning as her emotional anchor. Structure outside, processing inside. She dried her hands slowly, then paused for a fraction of a second near the counter, not reaching for the receipt, not avoiding it, simply acknowledging its presence internally. And in that small pause existed a powerful life lesson. Avoidance is not always about fear. Sometimes, it is about emotional timing. Emma believed that if something truly mattered, Daniel would mention it naturally. Daniel believed that if it truly concerned her, she would ask directly. 2 thoughtful assumptions. 1 shared silence. Later that afternoon, Emma worked from the living room as usual, her laptop open, documents neatly arranged on the table. The soft instrumental playlist she often used for focus played quietly in the background. But her productivity came in waves, not because she was distracted emotionally in an overwhelming way, but because her mind kept returning to the same quiet reflection. He's been normal, kind, present, consistent. So why didn't he just mention it? From an educational psychological viewpoint, unanswered small details create more cognitive reflection than large dramatic events, because they lack immediate explanation. Large conflicts demand attention. Small uncertainties invite contemplation. Emma preferred contemplation. Across town, Daniel sat at his desk, reviewing emails he had already read twice. His focus was not on work. It was on timing. He had considered mentioning the receipt several times. That first night, the second morning, the third evening. But each time, the same internal reasoning stopped him. It's a small thing. Explaining it now might make it seem bigger than it is. And here lies a deeply important life lesson about communication. Delaying small clarifications often unintentionally increases their emotional weight over time, because silence allows interpretation to slowly fill the space where clarity could have existed. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. For the first time, he recognized something uncomfortable, but honest. He was not avoiding the conversation out of fear. He was delaying it out of habit. A lifelong habit of waiting for the right moment to speak. But the longer he waited, the more the moment stopped feeling right. Back at the apartment, evening arrived with familiar calm. Emma prepared dinner as usual, chopping vegetables with steady rhythm. The sound of the knife against the cutting board was soft and consistent, almost meditative. Routine again, stability again. But emotional awareness had deepened even further. When Daniel returned home, he paused at the doorway slightly longer than usual before stepping inside. Not visibly, but internally, he watched Emma for a moment. She moved the same way she always did, calm, intentional, gentle. Yet, something subtle had changed. She no longer glanced at him immediately when he entered, not out of distance, but out of thoughtfulness. This is a key educational insight. When individuals are processing unresolved questions, their attention becomes divided, not withdrawn, but internally occupied. "Hi," he said softly. Emma turned and gave a small, warm smile. "Hi. How was your day?" "Steady," he replied. She nodded. "That's good." Another pause followed. Not uncomfortable, but heavier than it would have been a week ago. They ate dinner together quietly, discussing neutral topics, work schedules, groceries, small household tasks. Their conversation remained respectful, gentle, and emotionally safe. And yet, something invisible sat between them. Not the receipt itself, but the silence surrounding it. After dinner, Daniel wiped the counter slowly, while Emma rinsed the dishes. His hand moved closer to the folded paper, then stopped. For a brief second, his fingers hovered near it. Then he moved the cloth slightly around it, instead of over it. Emma noticed. Of course she did. Quiet people always notice what others think goes unseen. She did not react outwardly. But internally, a realization deepened. He's aware of it too. That thought shifted something subtle inside her. Because now, the situation was no longer about a forgotten explanation. It was about a shared silence. And shared silence carries different emotional meaning than individual silence. Later that night, they sat on the couch together. Closer than the previous evening, but still slightly reserved. The television played softly, casting dim light across the room. Emma leaned back gently, her shoulder almost touching his. Almost. Daniel noticed the small closeness and felt both comfort and concern at the same time. Comfort, because the affection was still there. Concern, because the natural ease had become slightly measured. From a relationship education standpoint, this stage is critical. When affection remains but spontaneity becomes cautious, it often signals unresolved emotional awareness rather than emotional disconnection. Emma folded her hands in her lap and exhaled slowly. Not a sigh of frustration, a breath of thought. And in that quiet moment, something inside both of them became undeniably clear for the first time since the receipt appeared. The issue was no longer the paper itself. It was the weight of everything unspoken around it. And the longer two emotionally careful people stayed silent, the more that silence began to shape how each small interaction felt. That night, the quiet no longer felt neutral. It wasn't uncomfortable in the obvious sense. There was no tension in their voices, no visible distance in their actions, no sharp change in their routines. But something internal had shifted in both of them. And that shift, from an educational and psychological standpoint, often marks the moment when silence stops being protective and starts becoming emotionally heavy. Emma turned off the television before the program ended. She didn't usually do that. Daniel noticed immediately. "Finished already?" he asked gently. She nodded once. "I wasn't really following it." Her tone was calm but honest. And honesty, even in small statements, often signals that deeper thoughts are active beneath the surface. They sat in silence for a moment longer after the screen went dark. The room grew quieter without the background narration, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of evening traffic outside. Emma rested her hands lightly in her lap. Daniel leaned back slightly against the couch. Neither of them moved away, but neither of them fully relaxed either. This was the first time their shared silence felt observant instead of restful. From an educational relationship perspective, prolonged unspoken awareness can subtly alter how safe silence feels, even between deeply compatible partners. Emma stood up first. "I'll make tea," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Okay." He listened to the quiet sounds of the kitchen, the kettle being filled, the cupboard opening, the faint clink of ceramic cups. These were sounds he had heard hundreds of times before. Normally they felt comforting. Tonight, they felt significant. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything was being felt more consciously. Emma placed the kettle on the stove and waited, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the counter. Her eyes moved toward the receipt again. It had not moved. Not once. Not in days. That detail alone carried emotional meaning now, because objects left untouched in emotionally aware spaces often become symbolic without anyone intending them to. She did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she leaned slightly against the counter and exhaled slowly. Her thoughts were no longer circling the same quiet question out of curiosity alone. They were becoming reflective in a deeper way. Not, "Why is the receipt there?" but, "Why has it remained unspoken for this long?" That distinction mattered. From a life education standpoint, emotionally mature individuals rarely fixate on surface issues. They focus on patterns of communication instead. The kettle began to heat, its soft sound filling the kitchen. Behind her, Daniel stood near the doorway, watching quietly, not intrusively, not anxiously, but thoughtfully. He had followed her without fully realizing it, not to confront, not to interrupt. But, because the distance created by separate rooms suddenly felt heavier than the quiet tension they were already sharing. "Do you want chamomile?" Emma asked without turning. "Yes," he replied softly. She nodded and reached for the tea box. Another normal exchange. Another calm moment. And yet, both of them knew something important was approaching, not dramatically, not urgently, but inevitably. From a psychological standpoint, when two emotionally aware individuals recognize an unresolved situation, conversation does not usually erupt suddenly. It approaches slowly, through increased presence and shared awareness. Emma poured the hot water into 2 cups and placed one gently on the counter beside her. Then she turned. For a brief moment, she met Daniel's eyes directly, not accusing, not questioning, just present. That eye contact lasted slightly longer than usual, and in that moment, Daniel felt something he had been quietly avoiding acknowledging. Not fear, not guilt, but realization. The silence had extended longer than it should have. She handed him the cup. Their fingers brushed lightly. Neither of them pulled away quickly, but neither of them spoke. They stood side by side in the kitchen, sipping tea in the same quiet space where the receipt still rested only a short distance away. From an educational, emotional perspective, proximity during unresolved silence often intensifies internal awareness because the unspoken issue remains physically present. Emma's gaze drifted briefly toward the counter, then back to her tea. Then, after a few seconds, back to the counter again. This time, she did not stop herself. She reached for the receipt, slowly, deliberately, calmly. Daniel's breath stilled slightly, not in panic but in anticipation. She unfolded the paper with careful hands, smoothing the creases gently as if it were fragile. Restaurant name. 2 entrees, 2 desserts, date clearly printed. She read it quietly, not with suspicion, not with emotional shock, but with composed observation. Then she folded it again, and placed it back exactly where it had been. The movement was gentle, respectful, intentional. That action alone revealed something important about her emotional state. She was not reacting impulsively. She was acknowledging thoughtfully. And that difference is a major indicator of emotional maturity. Daniel set his teacup down slowly. He knew the moment had finally arrived, not as confrontation, but as acknowledgement. Yet, even now, his lifelong habit surfaced again, the instinct to wait for the right moment to speak. But another thought interrupted that pattern immediately. This is the moment, and delaying it further would no longer be consideration. It would be avoidance. Emma leaned lightly against the counter, her posture relaxed but her presence deeply aware. After a few seconds of silence, she spoke. Not sharply, not emotionally, not accusingly, just calmly. I noticed it a few days ago. Her voice was soft, steady, and almost gentle. Daniel felt the weight of that sentence more than any raised voice could have created, because it confirmed what he already knew. She had seen it. She had been aware, and she had chosen silence. He nodded slowly. I know. Another pause followed. But this pause was different. It was no longer filled with avoidance. It was filled with emerging honesty. From an educational standpoint, the first acknowledgement in emotionally mature communication often begins with simple, calm statements rather than emotional reactions. Emma picked up her tea again, holding it with both hands. I wasn't worried, she continued quietly. Not in the way most people would be. Daniel looked at her more closely now. Her expression was composed, thoughtful, sincere. But I was aware, she added. That sentence carried depth beyond its simplicity, because awareness without communication creates emotional space that grows over time. He inhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully, not out of fear, but out of intention. It wasn't meant to be hidden, he said gently. Emma nodded once. I didn't think it was. And that response surprised him more than accusation ever could have, because it revealed trust. But also reflection. Silence settled again for a brief moment, but this time it no longer felt heavy in the same way. It felt transitional, like the quiet before clarity. Emma looked down at the receipt briefly, then back at him. The receipt itself didn't bother me, she said calmly. Daniel blinked slightly. What bothered me, she continued softly, was realizing how long we both stayed silent about something small. Her tone remained warm, measured, honest, and deeply educational in its emotional awareness, because she was not addressing suspicion. She was addressing communication. Daniel exhaled slowly, a quiet release of tension he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to confront a truth he had been reflecting on internally. I kept thinking it was too small to bring up, he admitted. Emma gave a faint, understanding smile. And I kept thinking, if it mattered, you'd mention it, she replied. Their eyes met again. And in that shared understanding, a powerful life lesson became undeniably clear. Two thoughtful people can unintentionally create emotional distance, not through conflict, but through mutual silence shaped by good intentions. The kitchen remained quiet. The tea cooled slowly in their hands, and the receipt, still small and ordinary on the counter, had finally done what silence alone could not. It had opened the door to the conversation that had been waiting patiently beneath days of calm restraint. The conversation did not continue immediately, and that, in itself, was consistent with who they were. Emma did not rush into a long explanation. Daniel did not interrupt the quiet moment with defensive clarification. Neither of them raised their voices or filled the space with unnecessary words. Instead, they stood in the kitchen for a few seconds longer, holding their tea, aware that something important had finally been acknowledged, but not yet fully understood. From an educational perspective, emotionally mature conversations rarely begin with dramatic intensity. They unfold gradually, especially between people who are accustomed to careful communication. Emma was the first to move. I think I need some air, she said softly. Her tone was not heavy, not distant, just thoughtful. Daniel nodded immediately. I'll come with you. She didn't object. That small acceptance spoke more than words. Within minutes, they were outside, walking along their usual evening path toward the neighborhood park. The air was cooler than expected, carrying the quiet stillness of late winter nights. Streetlights cast soft pools of light along the sidewalk, and the distant sounds of passing cars blended into the background like a steady rhythm of life continuing around them. They walked side by side, close, but not touching. This was familiar. Their walks had always been quiet, reflective, and calming. But tonight, the silence between them was different. It was no longer avoidance. It was preparation. Preparation for honesty. The leaves on the ground crunched softly beneath their steps. Emma tucked her hands into the pockets of her coat. Daniel noticed, and, almost instinctively, he placed his hands into his own pockets as well. Mirroring behavior. A subtle psychological response, often seen in emotionally connected individuals navigating shared tension. They reached the park entrance without speaking. Normally, Emma would comment on something small, the weather, the stillness of the trees, the way the lights reflected off the walking path. Tonight, she remained quiet, her thoughts moving carefully rather than anxiously. From a life education standpoint, this kind of silence is not emotional withdrawal. It is cognitive processing. She was not avoiding the conversation. She was choosing her words with intention. They walked toward the same bench they often used during previous evening walks. It was slightly worn, positioned beneath a tall tree whose branches stretched quietly against the night sky. They sat down at the same time. No discussion needed. Routine still guided their movements. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A couple passed by in the distance, laughing softly. Somewhere across the park, a dog barked briefly before quiet returned. Emma exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air. "I'm glad we came out here," she said. Daniel nodded. "Me too." Another pause followed. But this one was not heavy. It was grounding. Emma looked straight ahead, rather than at him when she finally spoke again. "I want to say something clearly," she said gently. "And I want to say it without making it sound bigger than it is." Daniel turned his head slightly toward her, giving her his full attention. "That's fair," he replied softly. She clasped her hands together loosely. "I never thought you were hiding something serious," she said. Daniel blinked once, surprised by the honesty. "I didn't assume the worst," she continued calmly. "That's not how my mind works. From an educational psychological standpoint, this reflects emotional regulation and trust-based cognition, where individuals rely on established behavioral patterns rather than impulsive assumptions. But," she added after a brief pause, "I did notice the silence." That sentence landed quietly, yet deeply. Not accusatory, not emotional, just truthful. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "That's the part that stayed with me," Emma continued. "Not the receipt itself. The silence around it." He looked down at his hands for a moment before responding. "I kept telling myself it was a small thing," he admitted, "and that bringing it up later would be fine." Emma nodded faintly, as if she had expected that answer. "That makes sense," she said. "From your perspective," he glanced at her. "And from yours?" She was quiet for a few seconds before answering. "From my perspective, it became less about what it was, and more about why it wasn't mentioned." Her voice remained soft, but her words carried clarity. From an educational relationship viewpoint, this moment highlights a critical dynamic. When small details go unexplained, emotionally reflective partners often interpret the silence rather than the situation itself. Daniel leaned back slightly against the bench. "I wasn't avoiding it," he said. "I just didn't think it needed immediate explanation." Emma turned her head toward him for the first time since they sat down. "I believe you," she said simply. That response disarmed him more than skepticism would have, because trust was still present, but so was awareness. Another quiet moment passed as a soft breeze moved through the trees. "I realized something this week," Emma continued. "What?" he asked. She hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of care. "I've spent most of my life believing that silence protects peace," she said. Daniel listened without interruption. "My parents handled everything quietly," she went on. "No arguments, no loud confrontations, just calm conversations or delayed discussions." She gave a faint, reflective smile. "And I grew up thinking that was emotional maturity." From an educational standpoint, Emma was now engaging in self-awareness communication, an essential skill in emotionally healthy relationships. "But this week made me question something," she added. Daniel's voice remained gentle. "What did it make you question?" She looked back toward the path ahead. "Whether silence always protects peace," she said softly, "or sometimes just delays clarity." That sentence settled between them like a quiet revelation. Daniel swallowed slowly, because her words did not criticize him. They included herself. And that made the conversation feel safe rather than confrontational. "I've been thinking about my own habits too," he admitted after a moment. Emma listened attentively now. "I grew up in a house where words escalated things quickly," he said, "so I learned to pause, to think, to speak only when necessary." She nodded gently. "That explains a lot," she said. He let out a small breath of relief. "I always believed that waiting for the right moment to explain something was considerate," he continued. Emma tilted her head slightly. "And now?" she asked. He looked at the ground briefly before answering honestly. "Now I'm starting to realize that waiting too long can create confusion, where clarity would have been simple." That admission carried quiet emotional growth. From a life education perspective, this is a powerful example of reflective accountability, recognizing one's behavioral patterns without defensiveness. Emma's posture softened slightly. "That's exactly what I felt," she said. "Not angry, not hurt, just understood." They sat in silence again, but this silence felt different from the previous days. It was no longer filled with unspoken questions. It was filled with shared understanding. A couple walked past them, holding hands, their laughter soft but noticeable. Emma observed them briefly, then spoke again. "You know what the strange part is?" she asked gently. "What?" Daniel replied. "The receipt didn't change how I see you," she said. "Your silence almost did." The honesty in that statement was calm, but profound. Daniel absorbed it fully. And from an educational relationship standpoint, this moment delivers one of the most important lessons in healthy love. Trust is rarely broken by small events. It is more often affected by prolonged lack of communication about those events. He turned toward her slightly. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to guess what was happening," he said. She gave a faint, understanding smile. "I didn't feel like I was guessing," she replied. "I felt like I was waiting." That distinction mattered deeply, because waiting implies patience. But extended waiting can quietly create emotional distance if clarity does not arrive. The wind moved softly through the trees above them. and for the first time in days, the silence between Emma and Daniel no longer felt protective, heavy, or uncertain. It felt open, honest, and ready for the truth that would finally bring clarity to something that had never truly been a secret. Only a delay. The park grew quieter as the night deepened. Streetlights flickered softly above the path, and the distant sounds of the city felt muted, as if the world itself had slowed to match the pace of their conversation. Emma and Daniel remained seated on the bench, close but not touching, their presence grounded in a calm honesty that had taken days of silence to reach. For the first time since the receipt appeared, the space between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt ready. Daniel inhaled slowly, the cool air steadying his thoughts. He did not rush his words, not out of hesitation now, but out of intention. "I should have told you the day it happened," he said quietly. Emma did not interrupt. She simply listened. Active listening, from an educational standpoint, is one of the most powerful components of emotionally healthy communication. It allows truth to emerge without defensiveness or escalation. "My sister came into town unexpectedly," he continued. "She called me that afternoon. She didn't want to stay over because she said she didn't want to disrupt our routine, and she hates eating alone in new places." Emma's expression did not shift dramatically. It softened slightly. "I took her to that restaurant," he added. "The one on the receipt." A small breeze moved past them. Emma nodded once, absorbing the information not as a revelation but as clarification. "That makes sense," she said calmly, and she meant it. Not because she had already guessed the explanation, but because the explanation aligned with Daniel's consistent character. From an educational psychological perspective, when explanations match established behavioral patterns, trust is reinforced rather than questioned. "I almost mentioned it that night," Daniel went on. "You were reading on the couch when I got back. You looked peaceful. I didn't want to interrupt your evening with something that felt small." Emma glanced down briefly, reflecting. "And the next day," he continued, "it started to feel unnecessary." Then another day passed, and by then, bringing it up felt like it would sound defensive, even though there was nothing to defend. He paused, then added with quiet honesty, "So I stayed silent." Emma exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, not in frustration, but in understanding. "You see how that unfolded?" she asked gently. Daniel nodded immediately. "Yes, that's what stayed with me," she said. "Not the dinner, not the receipt, just the silence expanding around something simple." Her tone remained calm, educational in its clarity rather than emotional in its reaction. From a life education standpoint, this moment demonstrates a key relational truth. Intent and impact are not always the same. A harmless intention, when paired with delayed communication, can unintentionally create emotional distance. "I wasn't protecting a secret," Daniel said softly. "I was protecting what I thought was peace." Emma gave a faint reflective smile. "And I was protecting that same peace by not asking," she replied. They both fell quiet for a moment. But this silence was different from the earlier days. It was no longer filled with unanswered questions. It was filled with mutual recognition. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've done this before," he admitted. Emma turned toward him, curious but calm. "What do you mean?" "In past relationships," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I've been told that I wait too long to explain things. Not because I'm hiding anything, but because I think timing matters more than immediacy." Emma listened without judgment. "And this week made me realize something," he added. "What?" she asked softly. "That waiting for the perfect moment often creates a heavier moment than simply speaking early." That sentence carried one of the strongest educational lessons of the story so far. Emma nodded slowly. "That's true," she said. "Because silence leaves space for interpretation, even when trust exists." He looked at her with quiet gratitude. "You didn't assume the worst," he said. She shook her head gently. "No, I didn't." Then, after a brief pause, she added with calm sincerity, "But I did notice the pattern." Daniel's brow softened slightly. "What pattern?" he asked. She folded her hands in her lap, her voice thoughtful rather than critical. "You're very careful with words," she said. "You always have been, and that's one of the things I respect about you." He didn't interrupt. "But careful communication," she continued, "can sometimes become delayed communication. And delayed communication, even when harmless, can feel like emotional distance." That observation was not an accusation. It was insight. And insight, delivered calmly, often creates growth rather than defensiveness. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words fully. "I see that now," he admitted. Emma leaned back slightly against the bench, her posture relaxing more than it had in days. "I also realized something about myself this week," she said. He turned toward her attentively. "What did you realize?" She gave a small, reflective smile. "That I've spent most of my life waiting for clarity, instead of asking for it." The honesty in her voice was gentle but profound. "My parents believed silence preserved harmony," she continued. "So I learned to observe, to process, and to wait for things to resolve naturally." She glanced briefly at the path ahead. And most of the time, that worked. Daniel listened carefully, recognizing the depth of her self-awareness. "But relationships aren't childhood homes," she added softly. "They require intentional communication, not just emotional patience." That sentence carried one of the most significant educational messages in the entire narrative. He exhaled slowly. "So we were both protecting peace," he said. "Yes," she replied. "And unintentionally creating distance," he added. Emma nodded once. Not dramatic distance, she clarified. Just quiet distance. A couple walked past them again, their laughter soft and fleeting. Emma watched them for a moment before speaking again. You know what surprised me the most? She asked gently. What? Daniel replied. I never felt angry, she said. Not even once. He blinked slightly. I felt aware, she continued. Thoughtful, reflective, but not angry. From an educational emotional standpoint, this demonstrates high emotional regulation, responding to uncertainty with reflection rather than reaction. The receipt itself was neutral, she added, but the silence around it became meaningful. Daniel let out a quiet breath of relief he hadn't realized he was holding. I'm sorry I let the silence stretch that long, he said sincerely. Emma turned toward him fully now. I'm not looking for apologies, she said gently. I'm looking for understanding. That distinction mattered deeply, because apologies address past actions. Understanding prevents future misunderstandings. He nodded slowly. Then I understand this now, he said. Small clarifications should happen sooner, not later. Emma's expression softened further. And I understand that waiting silently isn't always emotional strength, she replied. Sometimes it's just emotional habit. They sat quietly for a moment, the air between them noticeably lighter than it had been all week. Not because the issue was dramatic, but because it had finally been addressed honestly. Emma looked up at the sky briefly, then back at him. You know what this week taught me? She asked. He shook his head slightly. That peace in a relationship is not the absence of difficult conversations, she said softly. It's the ability to have them calmly when they matter. Daniel felt the weight of that lesson settle deeply. And what did it teach you? She asked in return. He considered carefully before answering. That silence should be a space for comfort, he said, not a substitute for clarity. Emma smiled faintly. And for the first time in days, the silence that followed did not feel heavy, cautious, or uncertain. It felt restored, not because the receipt had been explained, but because the communication surrounding it had finally aligned with the trust they had built over years. The truth had never been dramatic. The misunderstanding had never been severe. But the lesson was significant. Even the healthiest relationships require timely honesty, because silence, no matter how well-intentioned, can quietly reshape emotional closeness if left to linger too long. The walk back home was quieter than the walk to the park, but this quiet felt different. Not heavy, not cautious, not filled with unspoken thoughts waiting for the right moment. It felt settled, like a room after a long conversation where nothing dramatic was said, yet everything important had finally been understood. Emma walked beside Daniel at the same steady pace, their steps naturally synchronized as they had always been. The streetlights cast soft shadows along the pavement, and the cool night air carried a stillness that matched the calm between them. For the first time in days, neither of them felt the need to think ahead of the moment. That, from an educational perspective, is one of the clearest signs of emotional resolution, when the mind stops rehearsing conversations and returns to presence. I'm glad we talked, Daniel said quietly. Emma nodded. Me too. Simple words, but sincere ones. They reached the apartment building and entered without rush, the familiar environment greeting them with the same quiet comfort it always had. The soft lighting, the neatly arranged bookshelves, the gentle stillness of their shared space. Nothing had physically changed, yet emotionally, something subtle had shifted. The receipt was still on the counter, but it no longer felt significant, not because it had disappeared, but because its meaning had been clarified. Emma removed her coat and placed it carefully on the chair before walking toward the kitchen. Daniel followed, not out of obligation, but out of natural presence. He looked at the receipt briefly. Then, for the first time since it had appeared, he picked it up without hesitation. Not cautiously, not thoughtfully, just naturally. He unfolded it and glanced at it once more, not to reanalyze, but to acknowledge its ordinariness. Then he folded it again and placed it gently into the small recycling bin beside the counter. Emma watched the action quietly, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a symbolic one. From an educational life standpoint, resolution is often marked not by grand emotional displays, but by small behavioral shifts that reflect internal clarity. That feels lighter, she said softly. Daniel gave a faint smile. It should have been lighter from the beginning. She leaned slightly against the counter, her posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been all week. You know what's interesting? She asked. What? He replied. The truth was never complicated, she said, but the silence made it feel heavier than it actually was. Daniel nodded slowly. That's the part I'm still processing, he admitted. How something harmless can become emotionally significant just because it stays unspoken. This realization carried deep educational value, because many misunderstandings in relationships do not originate from major issues, but from minor uncertainties left unexplained for too long. Emma reached for 2 glasses and filled them with water, her movements calm and familiar again. I think it's human, she said thoughtfully. We assign meaning to silence when clarity is delayed. He leaned lightly against the opposite side of the counter. And sometimes we delay clarity because we think timing matters more than transparency, he added. Emma smiled faintly. That sounds like something you've been reflecting on all week. I have, he admitted. They moved into the living room without discussing it, settling onto the couch as naturally as they had done hundreds of times before. This time, however, Emma leaned slightly into his shoulder without hesitation. The gesture was small, but significant, because it returned without effort, From a psychological perspective, the restoration of natural physical gestures often signals emotional safety returning after a period of quiet tension. Daniel noticed immediately. He did not comment on it. He simply allowed the moment to exist. The television remained off. The room stayed quiet. And for the first time in several days, the silence between them felt like the kind they were used to, shared, comfortable, and unburdened. Emma exhaled softly. "This week taught me something important," she said. Daniel turned slightly toward her. "What did it teach you?" She paused briefly, organizing her thoughts as she always did. "That emotional peace and emotional clarity are not the same thing," she said. He listened carefully. "I used to think that if a relationship was calm, that automatically meant everything was healthy," she continued. "But now I realize that calmness without open communication can sometimes hide small uncertainties." This statement reflected a major educational lesson about relationship dynamics. Daniel nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he said. "Calm environments can still contain unspoken questions." Emma gave a small, appreciative smile. "Exactly." A few seconds of silence followed, but this time it felt reflective rather than heavy. "You know," Daniel said after a moment, "I didn't even consider the receipt important enough to mention at first." Emma didn't react defensively. Instead, she asked gently, "And now?" "Now I see that importance isn't always about the event itself," he replied. "Sometimes it's about the emotional context around it." From an educational standpoint, this reflects cognitive growth in communication awareness, recognizing that transparency should be guided by relational impact, not personal assumptions. Emma leaned her head back slightly against the couch. "That's a valuable realization," she said. He gave a quiet, thoughtful smile. "It took me a few days of silence to reach it." She glanced at him. "And it took me a few days of silence to question my own habits too." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "How so?" Emma folded her hands in her lap. "I kept waiting for you to mention it," she said calmly. "Not because I was afraid to ask, but because I believed that if something mattered, you would say it naturally." Daniel reflected on that. "And when I didn't," he said, "the silence itself became meaningful." "Yes," she replied softly. Another key educational insight surfaced in that moment. Expectations in communication often remain unspoken until a situation exposes them. "I think I learned something about my upbringing this week," Emma added. Daniel's expression softened with interest. "What did you learn?" "That my comfort with silence is not always emotional strength," she said. "Sometimes it's just a habit formed from growing up in a home where difficult conversations were delayed rather than avoided." He nodded slowly. "That's very self-aware." She smiled faintly. "And what about you?" she asked. "What did you learn about your habits?" Daniel leaned back slightly, considering his answer carefully. "I learned that my fear of saying unnecessary things sometimes leads me to say necessary things too late." Emma's expression warmed. "That's a very honest realization." From a life education perspective, this exchange represents mature conflict resolution, focused on growth rather than blame. Neither of them had raised their voices. Neither had accused the other. Neither had dramatized the situation. Yet both had grown in awareness. The room remained quiet again, but now the quiet felt earned, not forced, not cautious, just natural. Emma glanced briefly toward the kitchen. "It's strange," she said softly. "What is?" Daniel asked. "That something as small as a receipt could reveal so much about how we communicate," she replied. He followed her gaze toward the now empty counter. "It was never really about the receipt," he said. "No," she agreed. "It was about timing, silence, and interpretation." This statement captured the central educational theme of the story so far. Because in emotionally healthy relationships, misunderstandings often arise not from deception, but from delayed clarity and differing communication habits. Emma leaned slightly closer, her shoulder resting comfortably against his. "I'm glad it happened," she said unexpectedly. Daniel blinked. "You are?" She nodded. "Yes. Because it showed us something before a bigger misunderstanding ever had the chance to happen." That perspective reflected emotional maturity and long-term relational thinking. Daniel let out a quiet breath. "That's actually true." She smiled faintly. "Small situations are often early lessons," she said, "if we pay attention to them." And in that calm realization, the truth became undeniable. The receipt had never been the problem. The silence around it had simply revealed how two thoughtful, peaceful people navigated uncertainty differently. And now that clarity had replaced assumption, their quiet once again returned to what it had always been meant to be, a space of comfort, not confusion. Later that night, the apartment returned to its familiar rhythm. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but naturally. Emma rinsed the teacups with the same steady movements she had always used. Daniel wiped the counter without hesitation this time, his hands no longer pausing near an object that no longer sat there. The space where the receipt had rested for days was now just a surface again, plain, ordinary, and emotionally neutral. And yet, something deeper than the object itself had shifted. From an educational perspective, true emotional resolution is rarely marked by the removal of the issue. It is marked by the restoration of ease in shared behavior. Emma noticed it first in the way Daniel moved around the kitchen. He was no longer careful in the cautious sense. He was simply present. And presence, unlike silence, does not carry hidden weight. She dried her hands and leaned lightly against the counter. "It feels quieter tonight," she said softly. Daniel glanced around the room, then gave a small, thoughtful nod. It does. A brief pause followed. Then he added, but not the heavy kind. Emma smiled faintly at that distinction, because it was accurate. The quiet had returned to being what it once was, a shared atmosphere rather than a space filled with unspoken interpretation. They moved into the living room together, the same way they always had. The couch, the lamp, the low hum of the evening air through the slightly cracked window. Everything looked exactly the same as it had a week ago. But emotional perception had changed. Emma sat first this time, and instinctively tucked one leg beneath her. Daniel sat beside her a moment later, leaving the same respectful space he always did. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, without overthinking it, Emma leaned gently against his shoulder. The movement was small, but it carried meaning. Not dramatic reconciliation, not emotional relief. Just restored comfort. From a psychological standpoint, the return of unconscious affectionate gestures often signals that emotional safety has been re-established. Daniel did not react verbally. He simply allowed his posture to soften slightly, so her head rested more comfortably. I didn't realize how much mental space silence can occupy, he said quietly. Emma nodded against his shoulder. It does, she replied, especially when both people are thoughtful. That sentence reflected a nuanced educational truth. Silence affects reflective individuals more deeply than reactive ones, because they tend to process internally rather than externally. Daniel leaned back slightly, his voice calm and reflective. You know what I keep thinking about? He asked. What? Emma responded gently. That nothing about my actions changed this week, he said. But your perception almost had to adjust because of what I didn't say. Emma lifted her head slightly, considering his words. That's true, she admitted. And it wasn't because I doubted you, it was because the absence of explanation created a gap. A gap, he repeated quietly. Yes, she said. Not a large one, just a small space where clarity should have been. From an educational life perspective, communication gaps rarely appear suddenly. They emerge gradually when assumptions replace simple explanations. Daniel rested his hands loosely together. I think I underestimated how meaningful small transparency is in a peaceful relationship, he said. Emma gave a thoughtful smile. Peaceful relationships especially need it, she replied. Because when everything is usually calm, even small uncertainties become more noticeable. That insight lingered in the room. Not heavy, just wise. A soft breeze moved through the slightly open window, rustling the curtain gently. Emma glanced toward it, then back at Daniel. I also learned something about myself, she said. He turned slightly toward her. I was hoping you'd say that. She smiled faintly at his tone. I realized that waiting silently is not always emotional maturity, she said. Sometimes it's just emotional habit shaped by childhood. He listened without interruption. I grew up in a home where questions were softened or delayed, she continued. So I became someone who observes first and asks later. And this time? He asked gently. This time, I observed, but I also became aware of the emotional distance that observation created, she replied. From an educational psychological standpoint, this is a clear example of self-awareness evolution, recognizing long-standing behavioral patterns in real time. Daniel nodded slowly. That makes sense, he said. You weren't withdrawing. You were thinking. Yes, Emma confirmed softly. And thinking, when it goes on too long without conversation, becomes emotional space. They both sat with that realization for a moment. Then Daniel spoke again, more thoughtfully than before. I think I always believed that saying less prevented problems, he admitted. Emma looked at him with gentle curiosity. And now? She asked. Now I see that saying less sometimes just postpones understanding, he replied. That sentence carried one of the strongest educational lessons in the story's emotional arc. Emma exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing further. That's a very balanced realization, she said. He gave a faint smile. It took a week of quiet reflection to reach it. She laughed lightly, not loudly, not dramatically, but genuinely. And that laugh was the first completely unguarded sound she had made in days. Daniel noticed immediately, not because it was rare, but because it was natural again. You laughed, he said softly. She blinked, slightly amused. I did. I missed that, he admitted. Her expression softened deeply at those words. I didn't stop laughing because I was upset, she clarified. I stopped because my mind was occupied. That distinction reflected emotional clarity rather than emotional suppression. Daniel leaned his head back against the couch. That's another lesson, he said quietly. What lesson? Emma asked. That emotional distance doesn't always look like conflict, he replied. Sometimes it looks like subtle shifts in attention, tone, and presence. Emma nodded slowly. That's very true, she said. And those subtle shifts are easier to notice in calm relationships because there's less noise covering them. Silence followed again. But this silence was steady, comfortable, shared. Emma rested her hand lightly on the couch between them, and after a moment, Daniel placed his hand over hers without hesitation. Not as a dramatic gesture, just naturally, like before. From a life education standpoint, the restoration of natural touch often indicates that emotional alignment has returned without the need for grand reconciliation. You know what I'm most grateful for? Emma asked softly. What? Daniel replied. That we didn't turn this into an argument, she said. He nodded immediately. I never wanted it to be one, he admitted. And it didn't need to be, she replied, because the issue wasn't betrayal. It was timing. Timing. That word settled deeply between them, because it summarized the entire experience. Not secrecy, not mistrust, not conflict, just delayed communication between two emotionally careful people. Emma glanced briefly toward the kitchen again, where the counter now stood empty and ordinary. "It's interesting," she said quietly, "how something small revealed something important." Daniel followed her gaze. "It revealed our communication habits," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "and gave us a chance to adjust them before they ever became a real problem." From an educational relationship perspective, this reflects proactive emotional growth, learning from minor misunderstandings before they evolve into major conflicts. She leaned back into his shoulder once more, this time without hesitation or restraint. And this time, he gently rested his hand over hers with quiet certainty. No pause, no overthinking, no emotional caution, just presence. The apartment remained quiet, but now, the quiet felt intentional again. Chosen, comfortable, and grounded in a deeper understanding that had not existed a week earlier. Because sometimes, the most valuable lessons in love are not learned through dramatic conflicts or emotional crises, but through small moments of silence that quietly reveal how two people communicate, interpret, and grow together over time. The next morning did not feel like a new beginning, and that, perhaps, was the most honest sign of growth. There was no dramatic shift in atmosphere, no sudden declarations, no emotional overcompensation to prove that everything was fine. Instead, there was continuity, but with awareness. Emma woke at her usual time, the soft light of early morning filtering through the curtains in thin, pale lines. The apartment was quiet in the familiar way she had always appreciated, not empty, not distant, just calm. For the first time in a week, her mind did not drift toward the kitchen counter. There was nothing there to interpret anymore, and more importantly, there was nothing left unspoken. From an educational standpoint, emotional resolution is not about forgetting a situation. It is about no longer needing to mentally revisit it for clarity. She moved through her routine slowly, preparing tea as she always did. The kettle warmed, the steam rose gently, and without realizing it, she began humming again. Softly, naturally. The sound filled the kitchen in a way that felt both ordinary and quietly significant. Daniel, who had just stepped out of the bedroom, paused for a fraction of a second when he heard it. He didn't say anything immediately, but he noticed. Because familiarity, once disrupted, becomes more deeply appreciated when it returns. "Good morning," he said gently. Emma turned slightly, a faint smile forming without effort. "Good morning." Their eye contact lingered just a moment longer than usual, not out of tension, but out of shared recognition. Routine had not been broken. It had been refined. She handed him a cup of coffee without being asked. He accepted it with a small nod of gratitude. These gestures had always existed between them, but now they carried a renewed intentionality, not forced, not exaggerated, just more conscious. From a life education perspective, growth in relationships often appears in subtle behavioral awareness rather than grand emotional gestures. They sat at the small dining table by the window, just as they did most mornings. Outside, the street moved at its usual pace, neighbors leaving for work, distant traffic humming softly, the world continuing in quiet normalcy. Emma wrapped her hands around her cup. "I slept better," she said. Daniel nodded. "Me too." A short pause followed, but this pause felt light, unburdened. Emma glanced toward him thoughtfully before speaking again. "You know what surprised me the most about this week?" she asked. "What?" he replied calmly. "That the conversation we eventually had was actually very simple," she said. He let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a soft laugh. "It was," he admitted, "much simpler than the silence that came before it." That statement held one of the clearest educational lessons of their experience. Silence had complicated something that clarity resolved in minutes. Emma stirred her tea slowly. "I think many people assume difficult conversations will be emotionally overwhelming," she said, "so they delay them." Daniel nodded in agreement. "And in delaying them," he added, "they unintentionally give their minds time to create interpretations that might not even be accurate." From a psychological perspective, this reflects cognitive filling, the mind's tendency to assign meaning to unanswered gaps in communication. Emma looked out the window briefly. "I never imagined anything dramatic," she said, "but I did become more observant." He listened carefully. "I noticed small changes," she continued, "not in your behavior, but in my own reactions." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Like what?" She considered the question. "I paused more before speaking," she said. "I thought more before asking simple things. I became quieter, not because I was upset, but because my thoughts were occupied." That level of self-awareness was calm, not self-critical. From an educational emotional standpoint, recognizing one's internal behavioral shifts is a key indicator of emotional intelligence. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "I noticed that too," he admitted. "You did?" she asked softly. "Yes," he replied. "Your silence didn't feel distant. It felt thoughtful." Emma gave a faint smile. That's exactly what it was. Another gentle pause settled between them. But now, pauses no longer carried hidden meaning. They were simply pauses again. "I've been thinking about something since last night," Daniel said. Emma looked at him attentively. "What have you been thinking about?" He rested his hands loosely on the table. "That I don't want us to become people who only clarify things after silence grows," he said. Her expression softened immediately. "That's a very important realization," she replied. He continued. his tone steady and sincere. I spent years believing that careful timing was the most respectful way to communicate. But I see now that respectful timing shouldn't come at the cost of timely clarity. That sentence reflected a mature shift in communication philosophy. Emma nodded slowly. Yes, she said, because when clarity comes sooner, silence doesn't have the chance to reshape perception. From a life education perspective, early clarification prevents unnecessary emotional distance, even in highly trusting relationships. Daniel glanced briefly toward the kitchen. It's interesting, he said, that such a small event made me reevaluate a lifelong habit. Emma followed his gaze, then looked back at him. Small events are often the safest opportunities for growth, she replied. Because the emotional stakes are low enough to reflect calmly. He smiled faintly. That sounds like something you've thought about carefully. I have, she admitted. Another moment of quiet passed before Emma spoke again. I think I want to change one thing about how I communicate, she said. Daniel's attention sharpened slightly. What would you want to change? She took a slow breath. I don't want to wait as long to ask questions when something feels unclear, she said. Not out of suspicion, but out of emotional transparency. That distinction was significant. She was not rejecting her calm nature. She was refining it. Daniel nodded with genuine appreciation. That would help me too, he said. How? She asked. Because if you ask sooner, he replied, I won't rely on my habit of waiting for the perfect moment to explain. They both smiled faintly at that mutual recognition. From an educational standpoint, this moment demonstrates collaborative communication adjustment, a healthy relationship dynamic where both partners evolve their habits together. Emma leaned back slightly in her chair. I don't think our silence was unhealthy, she said thoughtfully. But I do think it was incomplete. Daniel absorbed that carefully. Incomplete, he repeated. Yes, she continued. Because it contained understanding, but lacked clarification, that insight lingered between them with quiet depth. He picked up his coffee again, now lukewarm, and took a small sip. You know what I realized this morning? He asked. What? Emma replied. That speaking sooner doesn't mean speaking impulsively, he said. It just means acknowledging small things before they become emotionally significant through silence. Emma's eyes softened with agreement. That's a very balanced way to see it, she said. He exhaled slowly, feeling a quiet sense of internal clarity he hadn't experienced in days. And what about you? He asked gently. What did this week teach you most? Emma didn't answer immediately. She looked around the apartment, the same peaceful space they had built through routine, patience, and shared quiet understanding. Then she spoke softly. That peace in a relationship is not maintained by silence alone, she said. It's maintained by honest communication delivered calmly. Her voice carried neither regret nor tension, only clarity. And in that moment, the lesson of the past week settled fully into their shared understanding. Not all silence is harmful. But when silence replaces simple honesty, even the calmest love can momentarily feel uncertain. And the strongest relationships are not the ones without misunderstandings, but the ones that learn to speak a little sooner, a little clearer, and a little more intentionally each time. That evening, nothing extraordinary happened, and that was exactly what made it meaningful. Emma finished her work at the same hour she usually did. Daniel returned home at his usual time. The door opened, keys were placed gently in the bowl, shoes set neatly beside the rack. Familiar sounds, familiar movements, familiar quiet. But now, there was something new woven into the familiarity, intentional awareness. From an educational perspective, growth in relationships rarely changes routines. It changes the consciousness within those routines. Hi, Daniel said softly as he stepped into the living room. Emma looked up from her book and smiled, an unguarded, natural smile that reached her eyes without effort. Hi, she replied. He paused for a brief second, noticing how easily the interaction flowed now. No cautious pauses, no internal calculations about tone or timing, just presence. How was your day? She asked. Steady, he said. Then, after the smallest pause, he added, My sister called this afternoon. She made it back home safely. Emma blinked once, then smiled faintly. That was thoughtful of you to mention, she said gently. Daniel let out a quiet breath he didn't realize he had been holding. That moment, simple as it was, represented change. Not dramatic change, not performative change, but behavioral adjustment rooted in reflection. From a life education standpoint, growth is often demonstrated through small proactive clarifications rather than reactive explanations. I almost wouldn't have mentioned it before, he admitted. Emma closed her book and set it aside. And now? She asked softly. Now it feels more natural to say small things as they happen, he replied. Not because they're important events, but because they're part of my day. She nodded thoughtfully. That creates inclusion, she said. Inclusion, he repeated. Yes, she continued. Not in a dramatic sense, just in a relational sense. It prevents the feeling of emotional gaps. That insight carried quiet depth, because emotional gaps rarely come from secrecy in stable relationships. They come from omission of context, even when the omission is unintentional. Daniel sat beside her on the couch, leaving a respectful space before naturally settling closer a few moments later. You know what I noticed about myself today? He asked. What? Emma replied. I spoke sooner during a meeting at work, he said. Usually I wait until I'm completely certain before contributing. But today, I shared my thoughts earlier. Emma's expression brightened slightly. And how did that feel? She asked. Strange at first, he admitted honestly, but also relieving. Like I wasn't carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts longer than necessary. From a psychological education standpoint, this reflects behavioral transfer. When lessons learned in personal relationships begin influencing communication in other areas of life. Emma leaned back slightly, absorbing his words. That makes sense, she said. Communication habits are rarely limited to one area of life. They follow us into work, friendships, and relationships. He nodded. I think I always believed that restraint was emotional maturity, he said. But now I see that timely clarity is just as mature. She gave a soft, approving smile. That's a very balanced conclusion. A comfortable silence followed, and this time, the silence felt exactly as it once had, shared, warm, and unburdened. Emma reached for the remote, but didn't turn the television on. Instead, she rested it on the table and glanced toward the kitchen. It's interesting, she said quietly. What is? Daniel asked. That the counter looks completely ordinary again, she replied. He followed her gaze instinctively, and she was right. The space where the receipt had once rested no longer held emotional weight. It was just a surface again, clean, neutral, and unremarkable. From an educational standpoint, once clarity replaces uncertainty, physical reminders lose their symbolic significance. It was never really about the object, he said. No, Emma agreed. It was about how we interpreted the silence around it. Daniel rested his hands together thoughtfully. I keep thinking about something you said at the park, he added. What did I say? She asked gently. That peace in a relationship is not the absence of difficult conversations, he replied, but the ability to have them calmly. Emma's eyes softened. I still believe that, she said, and I think we proved it, he continued. We didn't argue, we didn't escalate, but we still addressed something important. That realization carried quiet pride, not in avoiding conflict, but in handling it constructively. From a life education perspective, healthy relationships are not defined by the absence of tension, but by the quality of communication when tension arises. Emma shifted slightly closer to him, her shoulder resting naturally against his. I'm glad we didn't rush the conversation either, she said. He tilted his head slightly. You are? Yes, she replied. Because when we finally spoke, we spoke with understanding instead of reaction. That distinction was subtle but powerful. Immediate reactions often carry emotion. Delayed reflections, when handled responsibly, can carry clarity. Daniel considered that carefully. So the silence wasn't entirely negative? He asked. Emma shook her head gently. No, she said. It gave us time to observe our patterns. But the lesson is that silence should lead to communication, not replace it. That sentence lingered between them with quiet significance. He exhaled slowly, feeling a deeper sense of calm than he had experienced in days. I think this week changed how I see communication, he admitted. How so? She asked. I used to think that explaining small things was unnecessary, he said. Now I see that small explanations prevent unnecessary emotional processing. Emma gave a faint, knowing smile. That's a very insightful realization. Another pause followed, but it was light, easy, restorative. Emma rested her hands in her lap and spoke again after a moment. I noticed something else about us this week, she said. Daniel looked at her attentively. What did you notice? That we were never afraid of the truth, she replied. We were only cautious about the timing of it. He nodded slowly. That's accurate. And that caution, she continued, came from our upbringing and past experiences, not from lack of trust. From an educational psychological perspective, this highlights how childhood emotional environments shape adult communication habits, even in healthy relationships. Daniel leaned back slightly, reflecting. My childhood taught me that careless words cause damage, he said. And mine taught me that unspoken tension eventually fades, Emma added. They both smiled faintly at the contrast. But adulthood, she continued softly, is teaching us that clarity prevents unnecessary tension altogether. That realization settled deeply between them, not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a quiet evolution. Daniel reached for her hand this time without hesitation, not slowly, not cautiously, just naturally. She intertwined her fingers with his, just as naturally. The gesture required no thought, no timing, no internal reflection, and that was the clearest sign of emotional restoration. From a life education standpoint, when communication improves, emotional spontaneity often returns without effort. You know, Emma said gently, this could have easily become a misunderstanding if we had continued staying silent. Daniel nodded. Yes, he admitted, and the longer silence lasted, the more meaning it would have carried. She leaned slightly closer. I'm glad we didn't let it grow into something larger, she said. So am I, he replied quietly. The room remained calm, the night deepened outside. And inside their shared space, something subtle but lasting had changed. Not their love, not their routines, not their quiet nature, but their willingness to speak a little sooner, clarify a little earlier, and understand each other a little more intentionally. Because in the end, the strongest relationships are not those without moments of silence, but those where silence is eventually met with calm honesty before it has the chance to become distance. Valentine's Day arrived quietly, not with roses, not with grand plans, not with loud anticipation or elaborate gestures that demanded emotional attention. It arrived the way most meaningful days in Emma and Daniel's life did, softly, almost unnoticed until it was already present. Morning light filtered gently through the curtains, casting pale warmth across the living room floor. The apartment was calm, steady, and deeply familiar. There were no decorations, no reservations written on the calendar, no external symbols announcing the occasion. And yet, the day carried significance, not because of tradition, but because of what the past week had quietly taught them. From an educational perspective, emotionally mature relationships rarely rely on symbolic holidays to create meaning. Instead, those moments become opportunities to reflect on growth, communication, and emotional alignment. Emma stood in the kitchen, preparing tea as she always did. The soft hum of the kettle filled the room, and without realizing it, she found herself humming again, an unconscious habit that had fully returned. Daniel noticed from the doorway. He leaned lightly against the frame, watching her for a moment before speaking. "Happy Valentine's Day," he said gently. Emma turned, slightly surprised, then smiled. "Happy Valentine's Day," she replied. No exaggerated excitement, just warmth. And that warmth felt more genuine than any dramatic celebration could have been. She handed him his coffee without being asked, and he accepted it with the same quiet gratitude that had always existed between them. But today, there was something more intentional in his gaze. Not cautious, not reflective in the heavy way it had been days ago. Just present. "I was thinking," he said, after a small pause. Emma raised an eyebrow slightly, amused by the familiar introduction. "You usually are," she replied softly. He smiled faintly. "I was thinking about how different this Valentine's Day feels compared to last year." She leaned lightly against the counter. "In what way?" she asked. He considered his words carefully, as he always did. Only now, the care no longer delayed clarity. "Last year, I thought love was mostly about consistency," he said. "Routine, stability, shared quiet." Emma nodded slowly. "And now?" she asked. "Now, I think love is also about timely honesty," he replied. That sentence settled into the room with quiet depth. From a life education standpoint, emotional growth often redefines previously held beliefs, rather than replacing them entirely. Emma took a sip of her tea. "I think consistency and honesty work together," she said thoughtfully. "One creates safety, the other maintains trust." Daniel nodded in agreement. "That makes sense." They moved to the small dining table by the window, just as they did most mornings. Outside, the street carried its usual rhythm. People walking, cars passing, life unfolding in ordinary motion. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt subtly reflective, not heavy, not tense, just aware. "I realized something else this week," Emma said quietly. Daniel looked at her attentively. "What did you realize?" She rested her hands around her cup. "That I don't want our relationship to become so peaceful that we hesitate to address small uncertainties," she said. Her tone was calm, not critical. He listened without interruption. "I used to think that avoiding unnecessary conversations protected emotional harmony," she continued. "But now I see that gentle clarification actually protects it better." That insight reflected a major educational lesson about long-term relationship health. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I agree," he said, "because silence protects peace temporarily, but clarity protects peace long-term." Emma's eyes softened slightly. "That's a very balanced way to put it." A quiet pause followed, but this pause was comfortable, reflective, grounded, not the kind that required interpretation. Daniel set his cup down gently. "I had originally planned something for tonight," he admitted. Emma tilted her head slightly. "You did?" "Yes," he said. "Not a restaurant. Just dinner at home. Something simple." She smiled faintly. "That sounds like us." He nodded. "It does." Another moment passed before he spoke again, this time with more intentional sincerity. "But I also planned something else," he added. Emma watched him carefully now, sensing the shift in tone. "What is it?" she asked softly. He took a slow breath. "I wanted to say something clearly today," he said. "Not because there's a problem, but because clarity feels more important now than waiting for the perfect moment." Her expression remained calm, encouraging. "I'm listening," she replied. Daniel leaned slightly forward, his voice steady. "I love the quiet we share," he said. "I always have. It makes our relationship feel safe and grounded." Emma's posture softened at his words. "But I don't want our quiet to ever become a place where small things remain unspoken for too long," he continued. "I don't want you to feel like you're waiting for clarity when I could simply offer it." The honesty was direct but gentle, not dramatic, not performative, just sincere. From an educational perspective, this is a model of emotionally mature communication, clear, calm, and intentional, without emotional escalation. Emma blinked once, absorbing the weight of his words. "I appreciate that," she said softly. He met her gaze fully now. "And I also want to be someone who speaks sooner," he added. "Not impulsively, not excessively. Just honestly, when something small might otherwise become meaningful through silence." Emma gave a faint, deeply understanding smile. "That's exactly the kind of communication I want too," she replied. She paused briefly before continuing. "I don't need constant explanations," she said. "I just need to feel included in the small details of your life." That distinction was subtle but powerful. Inclusion, not interrogation. Transparency, not over-explanation. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's fair," he said. "And I'll do the same," Emma added. "If something feels unclear, I won't just observe silently for days. I'll ask calmly." He let out a quiet breath of relief. "That would help me more than you realize." From a psychological standpoint, Mutual communication agreements strengthen relational security more effectively than one-sided behavioral change. Emma glanced briefly toward the kitchen. You know, she said thoughtfully, it's strange how that receipt appeared on the week leading up to Valentine's Day. Daniel followed her gaze instinctively. Yes, he admitted. It almost feels symbolic, she continued. Not as a sign of conflict, but as a quiet reminder. A reminder of what? He asked. That love is not tested by grand crises, she said softly. It's tested by how we handle small moments of uncertainty. That statement carried the emotional essence of their entire experience. Daniel smiled faintly. I think that's the most accurate lesson of all. Silence settled between them again. But now, the silence felt complete. Not unfinished, not anticipatory, just shared. Emma leaned slightly back in her chair, her expression peaceful. This is probably the calmest Valentine's Day conversation about communication anyone has ever had, she said lightly. Daniel let out a soft laugh. And probably the most honest, he replied. She nodded once. Yes, honest, without being dramatic. From a life education perspective, the healthiest emotional resolutions are often the quietest ones, free from theatrics, yet deeply transformative. Daniel reached across the table and rested his hand lightly over hers. I don't think the receipt was ever meant for you, he said gently. Emma's lips curved into a faint smile. No, she replied. But the lesson around it was, and in that calm acknowledgement, the meaning of the past week finally settled fully into place. Not as a conflict resolved, but as a deeper understanding gained through silence, reflection, and the quiet courage to speak when it truly mattered. Evening arrived without ceremony. There were no reservations to rush to, no elaborate outfits laid out on the bed, no hurried energy filling the apartment with expectation. Instead, there was intention, quiet intention. Daniel stood in the kitchen, carefully chopping vegetables while the soft sound of instrumental music played in the background. The rhythm of the knife against the cutting board was steady, almost meditative, matching the calm atmosphere that had fully returned to their home. Emma sat at the dining table, watching him for a moment without announcing that she was doing so. Not critically, not curiously, but appreciatively. From an educational perspective, one of the most subtle signs of emotional security is the ability to observe your partner in silence without interpreting their behavior through uncertainty. You're very focused, she said gently. Daniel glanced up briefly and smiled. I'm trying to cook without overthinking it, he replied. She let out a soft laugh. That sounds like progress. He nodded, amused. It is. He moved around the kitchen with more ease than he had earlier in the week. No cautious glances at the counter. No internal hesitation about small details. Just presence. And that presence felt lighter. Emma stood and joined him quietly, reaching for the plates without being asked. Their coordination returned naturally. An unspoken rhythm developed over years of shared routines. From a life education standpoint, emotional harmony is often restored not through grand reconciliation speeches, but through the effortless return of small cooperative behaviors. Do you need help? She asked. You're already helping, he said softly. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, and this time the quiet carried no weight at all. It was the kind of silence they had always valued, the kind built on understanding rather than avoidance. Dinner was simple. Pasta, steamed vegetables, warm tea afterward. Nothing extravagant, but deeply fitting. They sat across from each other at the table, the soft lighting casting a gentle glow across the room. Outside, the distant sounds of the city continued as usual, unaware of the quiet emotional milestone unfolding inside their home. This feels right, Emma said after a few moments. Daniel looked up. What does? He asked. This, she replied, gesturing lightly around them. Not forcing the day to be dramatic, just being present. He nodded slowly. I was worried earlier this week that today might feel different in a negative way, he admitted. Emma tilted her head slightly. And does it? He thought for a moment. No, he said. It feels different in a clearer way. That distinction mattered. From an educational standpoint, clarity does not always intensify emotions. Sometimes, it stabilizes them. Emma took a small sip of her tea. I think this week changed how I see silence, she said thoughtfully. Daniel listened closely. I still value quiet, she continued. But now I understand that quiet should be a space we share, not a space where we leave things unspoken for too long. He nodded, absorbing her words with the same attentiveness he had always shown. That's an important distinction, he said. She gave a faint smile. It is. A brief pause followed, but it felt natural, like punctuation rather than hesitation. Daniel set his fork down gently. There's something I want to say, he said. Emma looked at him calmly. Go ahead. He leaned back slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of reflection. I used to think that being careful with words meant waiting until everything was fully processed, he said. But now I see that careful communication can still be timely. Emma's expression softened. That's a very healthy realization, she replied. He continued, his voice steady and sincere. I don't want to become someone who only explains things after silence grows heavy, he said. I'd rather be someone who includes you in small details naturally, before they ever become emotionally significant. Emma blinked once, then smiled with quiet warmth. That makes me feel very respected, she said. He met her gaze. That's the intention. From a psychological perspective, expressing intentions calmly strengthens emotional security more than reactive reassurance. Emma rested her hands lightly on the table. You know what I learned about myself this week? She asked softly. What did you learn? Daniel replied. That my patience with silence is a strength, she said, but only when it's paired with gentle honesty. She paused briefly. I don't want to suppress questions just to preserve peace, she added. I want to ask them calmly when they matter. Daniel nodded immediately. And I want to answer them openly without assuming their accusations, he said. That mutual alignment settled between them like a quiet agreement, unspoken yet deeply understood. Dinner ended slowly, without rush. Emma cleared the plates while Daniel rinsed them, their movements once again coordinated in the effortless way that defined their relationship. Later, they returned to the couch, sitting side by side, as they had on countless evenings before. This time, Emma leaned into his shoulder without hesitation, and Daniel, without overthinking it, rested his hand gently over hers. No pause, no analysis, no emotional caution, just familiarity restored. The room was quiet, but not in the same way it had been days ago. This quiet felt chosen, intentional, safe. After a few minutes, Emma spoke softly. You know what the most important part of this week was? Daniel glanced down at her slightly. What? That nothing dramatic happened, she said. He smiled faintly. That's true, she continued, her voice calm and reflective. There was no argument, no accusation, no emotional outburst, just awareness, reflection, and conversation. From an educational life perspective, this highlights a crucial truth. Healthy relationships do not require dramatic conflict to grow. They require calm communication during small uncertainties. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling a quiet sense of emotional steadiness settle within him. I think this was one of the most meaningful weeks we've had, he admitted. Emma tilted her head slightly. Because of a receipt? She asked with gentle humor. He shook his head lightly. No, he said. Because of what the silence around it revealed about us. She smiled faintly at that. That we're both quiet people, she said. And thoughtful ones, he added. And careful ones, she continued. He nodded. But now, he said softly, hopefully a little more communicative too. Emma laughed quietly, the sound warm and genuine. Yes, she agreed. A little more communicative. A comfortable silence followed. Not empty, not heavy, not unfinished. Complete. Emma glanced toward the window, where the night had fully settled, the streetlights glowing softly outside. This Valentine's Day feels more honest than romantic, she said. Daniel considered that. I think honesty is a form of romance, he replied gently. Just a quieter one. She leaned slightly closer. That might be the most accurate description of us, she said. He smiled. Quiet romance, he repeated. Yes, she whispered softly. They sat together in stillness, their hands intertwined, their breathing steady, their presence aligned in a way that required no further explanation. And in that calm, emotionally honest quiet, the true resolution of the story revealed itself. The receipt had never been a threat. The silence had never been avoidance. The love had never been fragile. It had simply been a relationship between two thoughtful people, learning that peace is not preserved by saying less, but by saying what matters with calm, honesty, and the quiet courage to speak before silence begins to carry unintended meaning. The end. Educational life lesson. In emotionally healthy relationships, silence is not the enemy. Misinterpreted silence is. Timely, calm communication prevents small uncertainties from growing into emotional distance. And true peace in love is built not on avoiding difficult conversations, but on approaching them with honesty, patience, and mutual understanding. If this story touched you, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Because many relationships don't break from loud arguments, they slowly change through the silence of small, unspoken moments. And if you believe love stories should not only entertain but also teach real-life lessons about communication, trust, and emotional growth, make sure you subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more meaningful stories like this.